Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Police Federation of England and Wales Detective Seminar. We are absolutely delighted that so many of you have registered for this event. It is hopefully going to be an informative, interesting and enjoyable morning and afternoon for you all. If you've not registered personally and are using a link from someone else that's been shared, then you will be removed from the last session of the day. The last session of the day is the PC Andrew Harper investigative case study. It is a confidential session, and if you're not using either a PNN email address or a PolFed email address for confidential reasons, you will be removed. So please do register yourself. If you are watching together, that's fine. But if you're not, if you're using personal email addresses, then you will be removed from the last session. So go online and register. Today we'll be monitoring the chat. So all of you who can use the chat functions, please do post some questions. We want to make this interactive. After each session, we'll do some questions, and we will address as many as we can. If we can't get to you all today, we'll follow up in email. If you can't access the chat today, and we understand some people can't, then please do email any questions or issues to events@polfed.org. Now,
so we've put together what we hope you'll see is a great agenda today, and we're recording the event. So if you have colleagues who've registered and are unable to join us at the moment, they'll be able to watch it back in their own time. There will be some short breaks, so a 5-minute break around 11 o'clock, and lunch will be at 12:15.
So just very quickly to now the administration's done. I'm Ben Hudson. I'm the Secretary of Suffolk Police Federation, and I'm honoured to be the elected chair of the Detectives Forum for the Police Federation in Wales. This is my colleague.
So I'm Mel Warnes. I sit on the National Board for the Police Federation, and I'm the Detective Lead nationally.
So without further ado, we will move on to the first session of the day. I'm really pleased that Chief Constable Tim de Meyer, who is the NPCC lead for disclosure, has been able to record a session for us today, as he can't be here. Mr. de Meyer has been leading the portfolio for a number of years now, and has been an absolute advocate of change within the disclosure arena, fighting for movement around the DG6, which is a campaign that I, on behalf of PFEW, have been leading for several years now. As Mr. de Meyer isn't here today and able to interact with you, please do post any questions you have on his session, and we'll address it at the end of the seminar this afternoon. So without further ado, I will hand you over to Chief Constable Tim de Meyer.
Hello there, I'm Tim de Meyer, Chief Constable of Surrey Police and the NPCC lead for disclosure. Now, I'm sorry I can't be with you live today, but I wanted nevertheless to give you some really important updates about disclosure, and I know you've been waiting with bated breath to hear all about disclosure because it's such an interesting topic for detectives. The first thing I want to talk about is redaction. This is, of course, a time-consuming task with which detectives will be acutely familiar. Now, it's my long-held view, as I'm sure it is yours, that redaction pre-charge is an inherently unproductive activity. We really should be able to share unredacted material freely with our trusted partners in the Crown Prosecution Service for the purpose of obtaining a charging decision. This would remove the waste which is in the system. It would accelerate our pre-charge file submissions to the CPS, and in doing so achieve justice much faster for victims, with a consequent benefit, of course, for public safety. So I'm really pleased to report that following an enormous amount of work, strongly supported by the Federation and in cooperation with national partners, we have this pre-charge redaction pathfinder, which all sounds very dramatic, set up to meet this challenge. Now, what this is going to do is test whether pre-charge redaction demands on policing can be reduced by changing the process within the current legislative framework. So without changing the law and without negatively impacting upon the criminal justice system overall, because we do want to be good partners in the criminal justice system, and we want to recognise that in producing good justice, it's important that we cooperate with the CPS and the courts, and we don't just sort of shunt the difficulties from one agency to another. Importantly, the Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO, has agreed that this pathfinder process which we have devised complies with current data protection legislation. So if this works, then it will work within the law as it stands. My portfolio has worked really closely with the CPS to identify a suitable CPS area for this to work, and we found some forces who are a really good place to test and participate in the Pathfinder. The selection of the forces has been jointly considered by the Home Office, who are overseeing things overall, and a really important board, the Joint Operation Improvement Board, which is co-chaired by Rob Nixon, a Chief of Leicestershire, who leads for the NPCC on criminal justice, and the Director of Public Prosecutions for the CPS. So the Pathfinder is going to be running in the East Midlands CPS area with distinguished policing colleagues in Lincolnshire, Leicestershire and Northamptonshire. Support from the national team is going to be provided throughout, and the work is underway to create guidance for this, because the new process which the Pathfinder forces are going to be using does depart somewhat from current NPCC guidance in respect of redaction. So we're just working through one or two technical challenges, and after that the Pathfinder is going to launch in these participation forces. Now, you'll have noticed I use the term Pathfinder rather than pilot, and this is a really important distinction, because we're not testing whether this is a good idea or not. We know, of course, it's a good idea to relieve from detectives and investigators this pre-charge redaction burden as it stands. It's about finding the right way to do something rather than determining whether or not we should be doing it at all. So it is nevertheless vital that the new process is tested to ensure that the change doesn't hinder case progression and that it doesn't create new burdens for us or the CPS or the criminal justice system down the line. So the Pathfinder is going to include some really robust data collection throughout and some analysis of metrics to ensure that it's effective, and those metrics will range from timeliness, capacity, charges and much more besides. For those of you who are working in a non-Pathfinder force, which of course is the great majority of forces across the country, it's really important that you continue to follow the National Joint Principles on Redaction and redact as usual as things stand. It's vital that we test this carefully to get it right, and we don't compromise the system elsewhere, which might undermine trust in what we're trying to do here. So I implore everyone else to be patient and make sure that we wait to get the results of this carefully planned Pathfinder. Please also continue to make use of the redaction crib sheets as the system stands. This will help you to stop over redacting, because in the police we can sometimes tend to do rather more of what is required rather than less. And you can get all the guidance that you need on our NPC disclosure site on the national, on the Knowledge Hub. So redaction technology then. So in addition to my portfolio working on what requires redaction, we've also been well supported nationally on how we redact, because we know that we're going to have to do some redaction regardless. And that's all about recovering capacity for policing. So a new national framework of suppliers has been created for text redaction, all of which meet our specific policing, technological and legislative needs. And we now need to do the same for multimedia redaction tools, and we'll be updating chiefs on that when the work is done. Third-party material, really important area of disclosure, and the interim NPCC third-party material request form, a bit of a mouthful but vital nevertheless, was launched in October of last year as a result of an opinion expressed to us by the Information Commissioner, who of course oversees compliance with the Data Protection Act. Now, the Commissioner noted difficulties in the police relying on the consent of data subjects for lawful processing in the context of criminal investigations. And the main factors bearing on this were, for RASO in particular, the limited capacity of victims to make fully informed, freely given rational decisions during times of what we would all understand are high and acute trauma. Also, the perceived power imbalance between police and the victim, along with the perception that refusal might impact upon the ability for the case to continue. Those of you long in the tooth on disclosure will be familiar with these issues having arisen previously in respect of DPNs, which characterise the central challenge in disclosure. How is it that you preserve an absolute right to a fair trial and also the right to privacy of the victim? So it's really testing stuff. And they also noted the absence of the ability, to withdraw consent in any real sense due to the legal requirement on the police to retain material relevant to the investigation. So policing has rightly followed the recommendations outlined in the opinion and ceased requesting consent from data subjects to access third-party material when required. But difficulties have been encountered in relation to medical requests, arguably the most testing facet of this challenge. And this is because requirements under common law, which are quite distinct from consent as defined by the DPA. So we've worked really closely with NHS England and the British Medical Association to overcome these challenges, and a revised form and guidance were released in April this year. As well as the new amendments for medical and healthcare requests, there's been a new section added to capture views, objections and agreements from children and young people under 18, and also adults lacking capacity as defined by the Mental Capacity Act of 2005. And an additional level of authority has been introduced to ratify requests relating to counselling records. A chief inspector will now need to be satisfied of the balance between the public interest in obtaining counselling records against the consequential impact on the victim's privacy. And that introduction of the authority of someone of substantial rank in the process is a really important way of policing, signalling how seriously it takes the issue. So this remains an interim form while work continues with the Home Office to introduce statutory requirements into the Victims and Prisoners Bill in respect of third-party material requests, for which a code of practice is also being drafted. Now, all of this really attests to the hard work and just how far we've come in the last few years in working with partners in making sure that we reconcile all the competing interests in disclosure and have this properly enshrined in codes and policy. Given the close working between the NPCC and the Home Office, it's not expected that the final form is going to require significant amendments, which is good. So the revised form and the frequently asked questions, along with a great host and range of supporting guidance content, can be found on the excellent NPCC disclosure site on the Knowledge Hub, which is really carefully informed and maintained. On then to the independent review of disclosure, which is going on at the moment. And I'm very minded and indeed alive to the impact that the rebuttable presumption process has had since its introduction in late 2020. Now, we must, of course, recognise that this came about as a result of instances where policing, to be frank, failed to identify the unused material capable of undermining the prosecution or assisting the defence. The impact on the system itself and the broad wording of the categories has undeniably placed a great burden on policing capacity. So work in this respect and a number of other supportive work streams were well underway with national partners. But since then, the Home Secretary has instructed Jonathan Fisher, King's Counsel, to undertake an independent review of disclosure more generally and fraud offences in particular. Now, the scope of this review is very broad, and we are therefore just holding in abeyance certain work streams until the final report is released, because we don't want to do anything which is contrary to its findings, and any changes to the disclosure regime are known. But having been thankfully involved in the process and consulted along with my colleagues in disclosure by Jonathan Fisher, KC, I can say the preliminary findings are certainly extremely sensible and welcome. And of course, as soon as we know more, we'll communicate more. But I must just in closing take this opportunity to say we really must not lose sight of the absolute criticality, centrality and importance of disclosure to the criminal justice system and confidence in us. The system's a great deal more than simple disclosure schedules. It's really important to guarding against miscarriages of justice, because we know that disclosure failings at their worst result in the innocent going to prison. And that not only presents an obvious and devastating impact upon the individual, but also on public confidence in us. So in the same way as, of course, I know you know, we must dedicate proper time and care to a good witness statement or conducting an interview, we must dedicate the time and attention needed properly to review all relevant unused material and apply the disclosure test. That really is our job. It's one of the things which only we can do, so we must do it very well. And anything capable of undermining the prosecution or assisting the defence must be highlighted pre-charge. And we must also remember that disclosure is an ongoing duty throughout the life of the case. And should new or unused information come to light, we have to review and reconsider the disclosure test. So to rush or cut short disclosure is a false economy. If we don't make time for good disclosure, then we have to make time for the very serious consequences which follow. And finally, I would say that disclosure isn't some sort of administrative adjunct to the investigation. It's not an afterthought. Disclosure is the investigation. It's the obligation on us to follow all reasonable lines of inquiry, whether they tend to disprove or prove the offence, whether they implicate or eliminate the suspect. And those obligations apply from 101 to the witness box and from report to court. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope very much you enjoy the rest of your conference today. Thank you. Hello there,
thank you to Chief Constable Meyer for that input. So I'm just going to introduce the next session, which is with Leona Roberts. This next session, we're going to cover post-incident procedures, as many detectives and investigators are not aware of them, as well as coroner's court, and speak about a case when safeguarding and risk assessments went wrong. If you do have questions, please pose them in the chat and we will deal with them at the end, as they may be covered during the presentation. So over to you, Leona.
Perfect, thank you. Thanks, Mel. Hopefully everybody can hear and see me okay. Hello, good morning. My name is Leona Roberts and I'm a solicitor at DAC Beechcroft, and I work in the Police Federation misconduct team. So the team looks after the interest of officers in a range of proceedings, and that includes criminal, disciplinary and coronial. So we also provide out of hours service, and we advise upon post-incident procedures following a death or serious injury after police contact. So today we're going to be concentrating primarily on PIPs and coronial inquests, where the circumstances of someone's death are judicially examined, and as Mel mentioned, we're just going to touch upon a case study. Hopefully you'll find the session helpful. Please do post any questions as I go along, but yeah, there we go. That's what the session is going to cover. Perfect. Next slide, please. So the objective of today's session is to deal with the following key topics. So the first account and detailed statements that key police witnesses have got to complete as part of the PIP process. We'll look at the two-stage process, and evidential accounts are a key aspect of the PIP. And a decision by an officer, which obviously may have contributed or resulted in a death or serious injury, is going to be under scrutiny. So it's incredibly important for specialist advice to be provided to ensure that detectives or officers justify their actions. So I'm sure that all of you will have heard of post-incident procedures in custody or during pursuits or firearm incidents, but there are instances where a PIP could be called for detectives. And that's what I'm really sort of passionate about covering today, because I think often there's a lack of knowledge around the PIP process. And I think knowledge is incredibly important around how that would fit in to a detective scenario. The second point is conferring. So this forms part of the advice that's provided to officers on their rights and obligations. It's a topic that people do get sort of very het up about, but ultimately it's quite straightforward. So we'll cover that briefly. We then will move on to talk about coronial proceedings, and specifically dealing with an example of where the actions or inactions of a detective were questioned, or a number of detectives were questioned within the coroner's court. And then finally, sorry, could I have the next? There we go. Perfect. Thank you. We'll finish with 5 practical tips, which Mel and I have sort of thought about and spoken about, and hopefully they will help you consider moving forward. So first of all, there are, sorry, next slide, I must get used to that. So there's 3 preliminary issues that I thought I would mention. The first is vulnerability, because an officer who has been identified as a key police witness has got to provide an account, and they're going to be incredibly shocked, they're going to be anxious, and ultimately they're going to be vulnerable. And it's unlikely, I would suggest, especially as a detective, that you may have been involved in a PIP before. So it's incredibly important to, number one, be aware of welfare and the vulnerability of what those officers are facing. The second thing is early Federation legal advice, and I think that's something obviously that you're crucial.
Yeah, so absolutely. So you know, you need the Federation there to assist in obtaining that advice for you. So we are there to support you from start to finish during the entire process. That starts at the very outset, at the start of the post-incident procedure, right the way through to if there is a coroner's court, an inquest, right the way through till the end of that. And that's where we, as the Federation, give you support, get advice for you from our legal teams. Here, as Leona has explained her experience, you know, within the company, and we use only legal people that are fully aware and are experienced in this area.
Yeah, it's incredibly important, because actually when you're receiving advice in a PIP, it's not of course we're advising on the PIP, but we're also thinking about the long-term process, which is potentially giving advice in a coroner's court. So those early evidential accounts that are obtained can be or will be relied upon for years to come. So it's really important to receive specialist advice, and the Federation are the ones who support and facilitate that. The final thing is, I suppose, a practical tip, which is ensuring that no evidential account is drafted or recorded before you seek that Federation or legal advice, because within your role, I imagine it's very second nature to want to put pen to paper immediately to rationalise your actions or inaction, and often that can be a dangerous thing to do, arguably in a PIP scenario where you've not had legal advice. So don't put an entry on the log that's retrospective, or don't put your notes in your investigator blue book. In fact, just take space, take a moment and speak to the Federation, because you'll get the right advice, rather than putting yourself in that vulnerable position. So we're now going to move on to the provision of accounts. Thank you. So I'm going to touch upon all the stages very briefly, but actually most important for officers or detectives is the stage 3 and 4. So first of all, there are 4 stages of the PIP, and it's really important to distinguish between stage 1 and stage 2, and then stage 3 and stage 4. So stage 1 is very much operational. And it deals with the situation report. It's not about, who, for example, discharged their weapon, or who was in the vehicle, or who was the OIC, and why an individual's honestly held belief around the rationale that they've taken. It's more around operational decisions in order to facilitate a PIP taking place. Then we've got stage 2. Which is the post-incident manager basic facts. Again, this isn't directly related to you, but it's just important to have an awareness of the fact that there's 4 stages. And the PIM, so the post-incident manager, obviously is usually either bronze, silver. They will liaise with the PIM and ensure that the basic facts obtained set out the officers that were on scene, the roles that they conducted at the scene, and who discharged their weapons. Now, that is very much obviously concentrating to firearms. This is the APP. This is how it's drafted, but actually the same scenario, or the same expectation of information, doesn't matter what the scenario is, must be set out in the basic facts by the PIM. Then we move on to the provision of evidential accounts. So this is what you would be concentrating on if you were ever to be involved in a PIP, and ever to be appointed as a key police witness. So stage 3 is the initial account. And this recognises your right to legal advice. So as per the slide, so subject to legal and medical advice, key police witnesses should provide a personal initial account of the incident before going off duty. So that section, which is an excerpt of the College of Policing APP, does give flexibility, but it does clearly set out that an initial account has to be obtained before an officer goes off duty. There's some flexibility around that, I would say, in practice. There's, I think sometimes, especially I imagine in a detective scenario where, for example, you've come on duty, you've taken over a case, a suspect's in custody, they're not remanded, they're then bailed, and they then unfortunately either go and commit suicide, or they have an interaction where they cause serious injury to another member of the public. That would be classified as a PIP in my view. And often if you've been on duty for, let's say, 10 or 14 hours, or actually you've left work and you've finished your shift, sometimes forces do get in contact and ask you to come back on duty. And again, that's an important scenario that you would want to get legal advice on, because actually that's not technically compliant with the APP. Of course, if an officer is injured, then you will have sufficient time to obtain legal advice. But the key thing here is that an initial account has to be provided before you go off duty. So what does that statement look like? Now you're going to be on duty for another 12 hours, hopefully not. Next slide, please. I'm just going to cover off what your initial account would look like. And actually, the key here is that it's initial and it's brief. We usually advise no more than half a page. So it sets out your identity. It sets out your understanding of the operation, your role, and then the essential details of your recollection of whatever incident you were involved in. So again, the APP covers off what the actions or what the content should be, tailoring specifically to firearms or use of force, but it does apply to all scenarios, and it's essentially a chronological summary of your actions and your honestly held belief, excuse me, your honestly held belief that resulted in you taking action or inaction. Essential detail is the most important thing here. It's not chapter and verse, it is very much a summary. Then we move on to stage 4 detailed account. Next slide, please. So this is where the full details from the incident should be included. And I've set out there another excerpt from the College of Policing APP, and detailed accounts should not normally be obtained immediately. They can be left until the KPWs involved in, again, the shooting or incident are able to articulate their experience in a coherent and detailed format. And that's usually at least 48 hours. And I mean, I know, Mel, in our experience of doing PIPs together, it sometimes goes up to a week even. It depends on the seriousness of the incident, I would say. Now, this is really key, important guidance, and that's because it recognises, again, the vulnerability of a KPW, and that 48-hour gap is ultimately a period of rest. And it's based on perceptual distortion. That isn't a lawyer putting in a defensive mechanism for the client or for an officer. It's actually the effect of trauma on perception and recall. And that delay is well-founded and based on expert medical evidence provided to the Home Office guidance. Next slide, please. So I touch upon it briefly here, and I thought actually, when I usually talk about this topic, I always refer to the case of Cherry Gross, and some of you may or may not be aware of that, but of this case, but this is the first case which demonstrated that a PIP process was required. So in 1985, Inspector Lovelock discharged a round by accident when searching an address in Brixton. And he was searching for Michael Gross, who had discharged a shotgun at Hertfordshire detectives the previous day. Now, Inspector Lovelock, when he got into the address, flinched, and he was surprised by the mother of the suspect, and he accidentally squeezed the trigger, resulting in Mrs. Gross being paralysed. So clearly, back in 1985, there was no PIP process, and Inspector Lovelock was asked to write an account, which he did the morning of the incident. That statement was 20 pages long. He was in complete shock, and unsurprisingly, his account wasn't great. He was then interviewed under caution the same day, and because of the inconsistencies, he ended up actually being charged and facing a trial for GBH. You'll be relieved to hear he was acquitted. But uniquely, and I think this is absolutely the key point to take away from the interaction between PIPs and Coroner's Court, is that Inspector Lovelock had to give evidence at a coroner's inquest 30 years later. So not a few years like we're used to. I think probably my max is 9 years, but actually 30 years later, when Mrs. Gross died, and the coroner decided that, as the death certificate set out, she suffered from paraplegia related to a gunshot wound, and because of that, the coroner was obliged to hold an Article 2 compliant jury inquest. So that demonstrates to you the importance of the PIP process and the protections that it puts in place for KPWs. Now, I've got up on the screen at the moment perceptual distortion, because it's the experience of adrenaline. You go into fight or flight mode, your brain's not working properly, all the energy is sapped from your brain, and then the exhaustion hits. So it's really important to have that 48-hour period of rest to enable you to mentally recover and recoup. Your detailed statements, once they're drafted, are what will be used as your duty statement, or your, your detailed rationale for your actions in an investigation, or your inactions, or your lines of inquiry that you did or didn't follow. And you could be cross-examined on that account at an inquest in many years' time. So it needs to be carefully drafted and carefully articulated in a concise and clear way. And it's best placed to explain that after the period of rest. I know that we've had a question in the box, but we're going to deal with those at the end. So thank you for that. I'm just going to have a drink of water. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Now, I thought it was a good idea just to cover off actually how the PIP potentially impacts on a criminal investigation, especially for detectives and investigations, because I appreciate, and having been involved in PIPs myself, and I'm advising KPWs, but there's a parallel criminal murder investigation, for example. And actually, it's something that I'm really passionate and I think is key around ensuring that there's an understanding, so that there can be communication to ensure that an investigation is progressing, but your colleagues or officers are having the right correct protections. So practical difficulties for you in your investigation. So what happens if accounts need to be obtained from officers urgently? And what's the answer, I suppose?
Yeah, I was going to say, how do we get around that scenario of an investigator needing evidence, but the witnesses are within a post-incident?
Yeah. So I would say, first of all, the PIP process, let's say it gets called on a Monday, you then need the 48-hour gap. So that would give you statements probably on a Wednesday or Thursday. So it's a very short period of time. The other thing I would say is that protection and that system has been, or the post-incident procedure has been decided by the force, whether that be strategically or because, officers need that protection. So I think there has to be a element of patience, which I appreciate is probably not going to go down very well. But I would say different inquiries need to be concentrated on in that period. So, I know that you might want to conduct a suspect interview. It might be that you have to do that without key evidence at that early stage. But ultimately, those evidential accounts will be provided with you, provided to the investigator or to the detective. And I think that's what's most important. I think lines of communication as well in that scenario is very important, because I know that things can become heated with an SIO, OIC, lawyer, federation. But as long as there's a line of communication, I think that makes the process a lot easier. But in short, a significant witness, if they are part of part of the PIP, wouldn't be able to provide their MG11 until they've had that legal advice and the PIP process is finished, hopefully within 72 hours maximum, I would say. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to touch upon conferring, because believe it or not, or you probably, or some of you may be aware, that often, or when a PIP is called, the post-incident manager is responsible for giving and conferring warning notices. I think officers usually call it a non-conferring warning. So, of course, you're not supposed to discuss your rationale for your decision making. And it's really key that you don't fall into the trap of feeling like you need to debrief immediately with your colleagues, because sometimes officers get themselves in a little bit more hot water by just having those discussions that really they shouldn't be having at that stage. So just remember that you will have an opportunity to have a confidential conversation with the Federation. Everything that you would say in a consultation to your lawyer is legally privileged. So your opportunity, will come. But I would just encourage you, if there is a PIP process or you're worried and you're, going into a debrief and you're thinking to yourself, actually, should I be discussing this? Should I be going into this much detail about my rationale? Just seek advice, because actually you don't want to put yourself in a more vulnerable position. Conferring when it comes to the PIP process isn't actually prohibited, as I've set out there. Can I have the next section of the slide, please? Thank you. So in that second paragraph, conferring isn't prohibited. However, you can only confer regarding factual information. So for example, if you're in stage 4 or you're doing your initial account, doesn't matter which one, and you can't remember the time of your briefing that morning, you would be able to facilitate a conversation with the permission of the post-incident manager and liaising with the Federation in order to get that piece of information. So anything safety critical related or factual regarding the incident or chronology is absolutely fine, but it has to be recorded down by the post-incident manager. You shouldn't be discussing rationale for your risk assessment or referral to third parties or cancellation of bail and why you thought that those are the sorts of decisions you shouldn't be discussing. So that's the stage 3 and stage 4. Hopefully that gives you an overview of what the PIP process would look like. We've advised on PIPs involving so many different scenarios over the years, and there can be one key police witness up to 60 in firearm jobs. So it's can be a very different range of scenarios, but it's one of my favourite parts of my job, and it's really interesting, and it's absolutely key for coronial proceedings. So we're now going to move on to what I would call a slow time PIP. And actually, I think as detectives, you are likely or may have already had experience with this scenario. And I know it's something that Mel's got a lot of experience in dealing with. Yeah, I'm sure I think we've done one together actually. So
indeed, at least one. So we're going to go into a little bit more detail, but the slow time ones are absolutely the time when you need to make sure that the Federation are involved. And so if somebody's coming to you and say, well, we need to run this process, it's a few days after something significant has happened, then you need to ensure that the Federation are involved, and that you make sure they're called, or you call them yourself. And then they're the ones then that will support you through that process, make sure the legal team are called. And this can happen sometimes weeks after an incident, months in, and by that time, we need to look at what you'd already written before, start collating that information ready to speak with the legal team. So it's absolutely imperative, if you're having contact either directly through from the IOPC or through a supervisor or something, then even as a witness, you need to come to the Federation.
Absolutely.
It's your right to have obtain legal advice as a witness. So never be put off and think, oh yeah, I can just get on and do this, or I vaguely remember that, or I've got some notes. Always come to the Fed and we'll get you some legal advice and support.
It's actually, this is probably one of the most important sections of my talk, because this is what happens in reality. PIPs are missed because you're detectives. It's, the force aren't used to having detectives involved in a PIP, and they're not called and they're missed. But then 2 months down the line, you get an email from an investigator via your supervisor. Can you address A, B, C, and D in a MG11 for me? And of course, the IOPC do have a power to obtain statements, witness statements, and that's what's set out on the slide. But what's key is that you as a witness ultimately have the decision around how you provide that evidence. So on one hand, you could be invited to a witness interview, but actually more often than not, you will have already drafted your duty statement or your rationale on the OEL, or I appreciate there's a number of forces and everybody call things different things, but ultimately the crime log is what I'm referring to. So your rationale on the crime log, there might be relevant CCTV that you've previously watched in order to you know, make decisions on an investigation and what inquiries you've sort of pursued and prioritized. So you will have documentation and disclosure material that you will want to refresh your memory on, and you are entitled to obtain that. But what's better is if you seek advice, we can go through the official routes to request that disclosure, and then you can provide a statement in a written format, or attend an interview with Federation advice, and then a statement can be provided thereafter. But it's incredibly important to just take stock, have 5 minutes, get advice, because actually, if you don't get that advice, the IOPC could, you know, look to criticise if there's any small inconsistencies. And I always tell my clients, credibility is key, especially as witnesses, and 1, 2, 3, 4 small inconsistencies could then potentially be criticised at a future coroner's hearing, or when you're given evidence in a coroner's inquest. So it's really important just to take the time and get that advice, because you are entitled to it. By taking, sorry, I've just, there we go, got something in my eye. By taking this approach, you keep control over the content and the drafting of your statement. Whereas if you answer questions in a 4-hour witness interview, it's going to be incredibly important, incredibly difficult and stressful for you to potentially provide inconsistency. So as I put on the bullet point there, legal and Federation advice is key. And I think by pursuing that route, you will ensure that your evidence is going to be impressive and professional for a coroner's inquest, and that's all we want. So I've already just touched upon very briefly the coroner's inquest. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. But I thought it would be helpful to just touch upon a case study. And as I say, I've been involved in a number of PIPs in coroner's inquests and public inquiries. But this is a case example where officers from a number of different forces actually were required to give evidence in an inquest. Coronial proceedings is a hotbed of risk, I suppose, if I can put it that way, because the family will want to challenge every aspect, really, if they can, because of course deciding on the outcome of an inquest will have an impact on potential civil proceedings in the future for the family of the deceased. So there's a number of High Court, Court of Appeal challenges, judicial reviews, public law challenges arising from coronial inquests. So it can be quite complex legally. But this case study I'm going to mention deals with risk assessments and where they can go wrong. But it's a really sad case. Some of you may have heard of it. But on the 8th of February 2019, the victim, Ms. Godinho, or Ms. Mendez, was attacked and stabbed with a knife by her then husband. So 2 of the wounds caused significant blood loss, and her death was confirmed on scene. Prior to these events, there was contact with police, and that's what we're going to run through. So first of all, on the 27th of December 2018, so just over 2 months prior, the victim had made a complaint to the police of domestic abuse on the part of her then husband. Initially, the risk of harm to her was assessed to be high. The following day, on the 28th of December, the suspect was arrested and he was released on bail with conditions, and obviously those conditions were designed to safeguard the victim. The main safeguards was that accommodation was provided out of county and the address wasn't known to the suspect, so that was key. The domestic abuse investigation, or the specialist team, I appreciate again forces call these teams different things, but the investigation was conducted by the unit, and the risk assessment was downgraded to medium. So there was then no risk assessment, safeguarding plan or investigation plan put in place by the unit, and beyond the initial report, no further evidence was gathered. Over the next few weeks, the victim made a series of further complaints to police concerning the ongoing abusive conduct. And on the 11th of January, the police learned that the suspect knew of the victim's new address, and that was through iCloud. I don't trust that thing anyway, but it was through iCloud. But no action was taken in response to that information. On the 16th of January 2019, the bail conditions were removed and the suspect was RUI'd. On the date of the victim's death, so at around 11:30 a.m., the victim made a further complaint to police about the suspect's escalating conduct at that point, which included him having access to her iCloud account and having access to all her communication. The police passed this out of force to the neighbouring force because of the accommodation that she had out of force. And unfortunately, the neighbouring force did make arrangements to see Ms. Mendez the day after, but unfortunately that was not before she was murdered. So that's the chronology, and it's not a straightforward case. There's a lot of contact. There's a number of complaints, but also there's cross-border to police forces trying to liaise and obviously fighting or not fighting, arguing or liaising around responsibility for who conducts what inquiries. And the lack of communication and liaison between those forces was part of the criticism. So now that we've looked at the facts, I just wanted to cover off coronial proceedings just a bit more generically, because are we okay for time?
Yeah.
Perfect, good. Not talking too much, hopefully. So some of you may have given evidence at coroner's court, but some of you may not. And they are inquisitorial, they're fact-finding, they're not a trial, but actually sometimes it feels like you are
very much so.
Being cross-examined. And that's why we need to take the controlling measures that we do in the PIP to make sure that we put ourselves in the best position a number of years later at the coroner's inquest. So the 5 key questions are who, when, where, and how did the deceased come by their death? And in majority of cases that I'm involved in, Article 2 is engaged. So what that means is we have a duty, or police, the state, have a duty to protect life. And if the state has been involved in any way, then the coroner has a choice whether to appoint a jury. But the majority of inquests that we advise upon an Article 2 is engaged, and that results in a jury being appointed. There are, can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Now, there's a number of verdicts that a coroner can reach. The first is lawful killing. That has to be satisfied on the civil standard, on the balance of probabilities. It's a tongue twister. Unlawful killing, open, and narrative. Unlawful killing, I'm just going to touch upon because that also has to now be satisfied on the civil standard. It used to be on the criminal standard, but as of 2020, there was a new case which resulted in that criminal standard of proof dropping to the civil standard, which obviously at the time was a disappointing case law for us. But in fact, there hasn't been too many, I don't think, disastrous situations with unlawful killing findings. Now, in our case study, there was a mix of findings. So we also obviously had the unlawful killing because Mr. Godinho, of course, murdered his wife. But there was also an aspect of narrative involved, and I will come on to that in a little bit more detail shortly. So that's just a very quick snapshot of coronial proceedings, but we're going to move on to the risk assessments in more detail, just building on the facts to actually look at the chronology of risk assessments in the case study. Can I have the next slide, please? So this demonstrates all the risk assessments that were done at the outset of the investigation. So you've got risk assessment 1, which was the outcome of the dash, and that was high, and that was drafted and ratified by 2 PCs on response. We've then got a review of the risk assessment, and that's the fact that the team sergeant agreed with a high assessment. That matter was then passed to detectives in the specialist team, SIU or SID, DA unit, whatever you want to call it. And within that team, the DC appointed reduced the risk assessment from high to medium. And the rationale for the reduction was, firstly, it wasn't clear where the information on the log derived from, because the victim wasn't an English speaker and an interpreter wasn't available. The second thing is that the victim was at an unknown location away from the offender, albeit the team were aware that the suspect had tried to track the victim on the iPhone. The third thing is that it was unknown if the victim was going to support police action or intended on giving a statement. Lack of witnesses was another aspect of the rationale. And then finally, it was all around the children and consideration of obtaining evidence from them. And on one hand, acknowledging that this was a domestic incident between parents and the children were young, so it might be unfair to involve them. But on the other hand, there was suggestion that they might have been assaulted, so that they needed to be spoken to. So slight contradiction in that rationale. And at the coroner's inquest, it's the reduction from high to medium, which was one of the criticisms. And the reasons for that criticism were that in the coroner's investigation, he concluded that the source of information was clear, the cooperation by the victim was completely irrelevant, questioning children under the domestic abuse policy was mandatory, and that contradictory information that I've just spoken about. So on one hand, suggesting that it would be unfair to involve them, but on the other, speaking about the fact that they had to be spoken to because of the risk of assault. But then finally, there was some sort of criticism around the tone used in the rationale. So it was quite dismissive, and that was a big aspect of the criticism. Now, the importance from reduction of high to medium meant there was no compulsory referral to multi-agency hub or MASH, and actually it was just discretionary. So obviously that was a number of different catalysts, or one of a number of different catalysts. So we then had risk assessment 3, which was a DS agreeing with that medium assessment, and the OIC was then appointed, who agreed with the medium assessment, did conduct an assessment, but didn't rationalise that anywhere. And then there was no ongoing risk assessment conducted by the team thereafter. So as I say, there was a lot of criticism, unfortunately, of the investigation. Can I have the next slide, please? And there were 6 concerns in total. So in an Article 2 engaged inquest, the coroner has can draft a Regulation 28 prevention of future deaths report, which goes, a copy goes to all the interested parties. So that can be the forces, the IOPC, the NHS, College of Policing, Refuge Inquest, charities, and any individuals. And I've just set out 3 concerns, which is what they were called on the document. So the first is the lack of training of domestic abuse team, and their failure to familiarise and put into practice the force policy. And that the coroner decided that was one of the factors that contributed to the death of the victim. Concern 2 was failure by the OIC to implement the same policy, especially with the lack of ongoing risk assessment, safeguarding and investigation plan. And concern 3 was supervision of the team, so failure to supervise and ensure that actually the investigation and safeguarding plan had been put in place, and that, more importantly, it had been implemented. So 6 concerns that were fed back to the forces, and it just demonstrates the importance of what you put down as pen to paper in either a PIP or your investigation. And I wanted to finish today just by talking about some top tips, and you can hopefully take them on board or not take them on board, but we've spoken about these and we thought that actually this is probably the 5 that I would want to make sure that you take away from today's session. Can I have the last slide, please? So first of all, and I think we've probably hammered this one home now, if you're not sure, seek Federation advice, especially if you've had contact from the IOPC in respect of slow time PIPs.
Yeah, and not just the IOPC.
Sorry, PSB as well.
Through your own force as well. It isn't necessarily just the IOPC.
No.
In fact, they're putting a lot more back onto the forces to deal with. So any concerns, always seek Fed advice first.
Absolutely. Second thing is always ensure you record your decision making, and I suppose you're all going to be going, yeah, well, that's obvious. And I appreciate it does sound simple advice, but in my experience, it's just not consistently done. And as well as recording your rationale, I think it's arguably more important to demonstrate that you've considered the NDM, demonstrate that you've considered your other options, or why you're prioritising one line of inquiry over the other, but just rationalise what you've considered and what you've disregarded, and then the action that you've taken. Top tip, do not copy and paste risk assessments. I've been involved in public inquiries where so many important documents, I know relating to firearms, but the same principles apply, where, you know, they're copy and pasted from operation to operation, and it really, really doesn't bode well in coroner's court when, you know, there's the deceased is represented by family, because it demonstrates the lack of care or accidental care. So don't copy and paste, and if you're going to, just ensure that you double check, no errors, typos, and also I would suggest that copy and pasting does breed complacency, and I know that's really difficult with the pressure on resources at the moment, but I do have experience of that leading to criticism at coronial proceedings. I've put there, don't rely on others. And what I mean by that is you must satisfy yourself, whether you're, you know, DC or DI, but you must satisfy yourself that sufficient safeguarding measures have been put in place. You know, you are the one who's going to be asked at an inquest, and trust me, the family do come at it from every single angle for obvious reasons, but you will be expected to have considered the log in full and to be able to rationalise your actions and inaction. So risk assessment, safeguarding, and overall investigation plan. And then the fifth thing is preparation for coroner's court is absolutely key. So if you are deemed as a witness, you will be represented by force legal, and you will have a barrister, but that barrister will have a number of responsibilities. And I think sometimes, you know, things can be last minute, you know how it is. And actually, officers or detectives, doesn't matter who it is, have got to take responsibility for your preparation. And that doesn't mean, you know, reading your statement the day before. It needs a little bit more preparation than that. So you might receive a briefing from Force Legal, but you've got to take ownership. You've got to reread your statements, your risk assessment rationale, remind yourself of what you've set out in your investigation book, because all of that material could be provided to the inquest. So consistency, again, is really, really key when it comes to coroner's court. Also disclosure, you wanted to mention around the importance of footage and
and any footage, etc. I know when it comes to preparation, you might not want to relive any event by watching CCTV or body-worn video, but that is absolutely key. And whenever I give my inputs around post-incident on courses, I always say you cannot over-prepare for coroner's court. The more you do, the better, and you must watch any footage. So do watch the CCTV and body-worn video. Get those provisions in place if you think, you know, you're not going to like doing that, but you must watch it, because it is going to be played in coroner's court, and you don't want the court to be the first time you've seen it since the incident.
No, that would not be a good idea. So thank you for listening. I hope you found some elements helpful. Do give feedback. And I think we've got one question at the moment.
We have, and it's in relation to the position of stage 3 and 4, either on a Section 9 statement or not, which has been an ongoing conversation for quite some time. So,
so I know that the position from different solicitors around the country does vary on this, but my view, and actually it does link back to the coroner's court, is the College of Policing APP sets out that now stage 3 accounts have got to be set out on an MG11 section 9 declaration of truth. And actually, in my view, the APP should be followed. And that means, once, of course, you obtain your legal advice on a blank document as per usual, subject to legal privilege. Once everybody's happy, that gets transported onto an MG11 for signature, and you serve it on that formal statement. and the Section 9 declaration set out. The reason for that is because if you go and give evidence at a coroner's inquest 3 years down the line, and you are cross-examined on the fact that you haven't put your statements, and I'm not saying this has happened, but I can see it as a potential cross-examination point. If it's put to you, well, you've not followed the APP, College of, the guidance here in respect of PIPs, the barrister for the family are going to say, well, yes, you received legal advice, but ultimately that was your decision not to follow the correct procedure and policy that's set out in the College of Policing APP. So if you've not followed it in respect of that, what else have you, not followed it in respect of? And I think it's just a tidy little cross-examination point, which, the family would put a bit of a tick box there for their sort of, for their arguments and for their case. So I just think actually we should be following the APP. That's what I advise, but I appreciate there is a differing opinion on it around the country. So I hope that answers your question.
Right, thank you.
I don't think there's any other question.
That's the only question that has arisen. So thank you very much, Fiona, for presenting that to us. It's definitely an area that needs covering from a detective point of view. So we're now going to go for a break. We're just a couple of minutes over. So if we can be back at 11:10, please. Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your desk stretching, which is something that you should encourage yourself and your colleagues to do regularly. So we're all sitting at desks so much. So welcome back, and Mel's going to introduce the next session.
So next we've got Sarah-Jayne Bray. She's the staff officer to Chief Constable Jason Hogg, who is the national lead for recruitment, retention and wellbeing of investigators. So we do a lot of work with Sarah-Jayne, who's is very hardworking, and it's always a pleasure to see you, Sarah-Jayne, and thanks so much for your time today. So over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you both, and lovely to see you both too. And thank you so much for the invite today. Really grateful for it. I won't spend too long on my introduction. I've got quite a lot to say. I'm going to try and claw back some time for you all as well, to get you back on track. So I'm just going to share my screen, because of course it doesn't count unless you tell people you're sharing your screen. There it is. So as Melanie just said, I'm Sarah-Jayne. I'm Programme Manager for the Recruitment, Retention and Wellbeing of Investigators, which is led by Chief Constable Jason Hogg. So what do? We do what is said on the tin, really. We look at how we're attracting in, how we're retaining, and how we're looking after our investigators. And we say investigators because we try to capture here police staff investigators, as well as our PIP 2 detectives, and indeed PIP 3 and PIP 4. The team itself, we meet quarterly. We're represented with all 43 forces. We also have multiple strategic stakeholders, the usual suspects you'd expect to see. So College of Policing, Home Office, NPCC, and so on. And we come together to share best practice, latest research, and to kind of talk about some common issues. We also have subgroups under each of those for each of the individual strands, where we get together and develop interventions. And we are so grateful for the forum here and Melanie and Ben's engagement in those subgroups and in the national work, because it's just a fantastic way to engage a broader audience. So why do we exist? Well, back in 2016, there was the HMI declared a national crisis in terms of our investigator numbers, and we were seeing a 22% vacancy factor. So that was 22% fewer PIP 2 investigators than what we should have had. And somehow this caused a huge surprise in policing. Everybody was really shocked by it. And the common refrain I heard at the time was, how can that be? It's the most exciting role. It's what they make television programmes out of. And yeah, of course they do. They do make television programmes out of it. However, there's a kind of key indicator here with the television programmes. You'll notice that none of these people are smiling, and most of them have some form of substance misuse, domestic or mental health issue that's going on in the background. And so it's not quite as simple as people didn't know about being a detective. There were far greater barriers attached to it. And so whilst the work in its early stages was very much, how do we get kind of bums on seats? How do we get people into posts? It broadened our work out to understand, well, actually, what's stopping people staying in the role, and why aren't people coming forward? What might they be seeing within those roles that are stopping them? And of course, it made us realise that we needed to take a long, hard look at what were the true challenges that our investigators are facing that meant they were turning away from the pathway, or that people weren't really as keen to step into it. And we talked that actually maybe a more realistic advert for the role of an investigator wouldn't actually include all these faces, but it would probably look something like this, where if we were really honest about it, our recruitment would include, you've also got to do a really intensive National Investigators exam, which, to be honest, if you're prepping for that, you may as well prep for your sergeant's exam. You also got to build a really complex and time-consuming accreditation process that'll come round and round and round again, whilst also trying to juggle a really busy caseload and try and have a home life and try and remain engaged within the whole kind of policing arena, whilst also probably doing something that's really new to you and a big jump. You're also far more likely to experience higher levels of secondary trauma, burnout, and PTSD, particularly around organisational burnout because of the massive demand you're carrying. And you're probably going to be 10 fewer rest days a year because you're not on a shift pattern. And just to top it all off, we'll pay you less. You'll be on average £1,200 a year worse off than your response colleagues. It's not quite the head scratcher, is it really, when you put it that way? And so we really worked hard to think about what does this mean for us and what does this look like? Now, I became involved in this work a number of years ago when it first started in 2016, 2017, and kind of drifted away from it as roles move. I was staff officer at the time to the then lead in South Wales. And we moved on and I was invited back, particularly for the angle around well-being. They were doing some amazing work around investigator well-being and they really wanted to broaden our reach. And so I kind of stepped back into this place to kind of help them engage colleagues nationally far more effectively to understand, okay, so what are the challenges here and what can we do about them? And we were really fortunate through things like the Investigator Week of Action, the Wellbeing Week of Action, through our contacts with 43 forces, through lots of different focus groups, surveys, and all those other things. We did a big piece to really reach out to you all to ask, right, what's getting in your way? Some of the key questions was around what are the barriers to entering the PIP2 pathway? And none of this is going to be a surprise to any of you. I know I am absolutely preaching to the choir here, and hopefully I'll be able to provide some reassurance of what we're trying to do nationally around this and how we kind of really focus in forces to pay attention to this. So people talked about the lack of support stepping into the pathway, or indeed a lack of confidence. Not really utilising investigative skills of PIP1 in the way that we may traditionally have done 10, 15 years ago, and not really feeling comfortable to step into that space. Just seeing the unmanageable demand that particularly was placed upon colleagues there, particularly around things like, not just CID, but our major crimes, our PPUs and so on. And actually, why would I move from shift work to CID to be worse off in that way, financially and in terms of rest days? And actually, there was a lack of opportunities for people to step in and to be kind of exposed to that investigative pathway and to kind of understand what the NIE and the accreditation process looked like so they could familiarise themselves with it. And we asked, well, what can we do to improve that? And they talked a lot about greater engagement locally, encouraging people to come and be involved in the investigative pathway, more attachments, more shadowing, and more support when they stepped into that role. Really looking at that pay and reward. Now, we talk about targeted variable payments, of course, and really encouraging forces to meet the gap through those. But I'll come on to that in a little bit. And ensuring that people have proper meaningful training in CPD that helps them actually do the role, that helps them feel comfortable and equipped to do it, and also that they feel valued and invested in. And well-being was a huge thing that came back time and time again to us to say we're watching colleagues who are absolutely exhausted as PIP2 investigators. We really need to look at how we provide meaningful support to them because it's just not cutting it at the moment. And so we asked, well, what does well-being look like to you? And what does that mean for you as investigators? And forgive me, Melanie and Ben will be used to me saying these kind of things, and it's not really meant to offend anyone, but you'll notice nobody's asking here for sleep webinars or nutrition webinars or well-being dogs, all of which are wonderful interventions and really have a core place within our well-being strategies. But they should not be the core essence of what our well-being strategies are, because it's not what changes well-being. They talked about wanting empowered supervisors who could recognise the signs of when people were experiencing burnout and were empowered to do something about it, to be able to give time away from it, to be able to kind of share workloads, to be able to attract people in to provide cover, and knowing how they could reach that support as supervisors. They wanted personal resilience training for themselves so that they could see what signs were should they be experiencing burnout, or that they could watch for it in their other colleagues. They wanted regular one-to-ones that didn't just focus on, performance, caseloads, but actually focused on what else is going on here and what else are you struggling with, barriers, hindrances, well-being, and so on. They wanted to see improved occupational health support. So we are seeing an increased kind of lack of confidence in occupational health teams locally, which was a real surprise to me. But when I've spoken to the National Oscar Kilo team and their clinician network, it's not a surprise to our occupational health colleagues. They know that there is a growing distrust because I think people feel with things like online psychological screening and, a lack of that kind of mandated support, it feels a little bit like a tick box sometimes around well-being. And they're working really hard nationally to look at how they can change that kind of mindset around it. And so how are we increasing kind of confidence in occupational health support? And what does that meaningfully look like for you? And giving people time to take up opportunities for well-being, time to take up CPD opportunities, and indeed time to see families, friends, have hobbies, have lives, so that we don't fall off a cliff edge at the end of 30 years. And so this was all incredibly useful for us as we started to reach and engage with you all. And it's been hugely important for us to help shape what our work looks like. So as a programme, we involve all those 43 forces and all those strategic partners to really delve into these issues. We've been able to develop that kind of streamlined recruitment pathways, and I think really encouraging forces to invest in crime academies. Forces that are doing their recruitment and retention well tend to start with a crime academy, where people are brought in with mentoring support, proper police protected learning time, proper support around how they go through the NIE and through that accreditation process. We've done a lot around developed direct entry routes and how we can consistently ensure that we improve those, that we retain people on them, and that actually they're not a kind of further pressure or drain on existing investigators as our new trainees come through, that there's support there for them. The pay issue is a big one for me, and it's something that, again, the team here are often hearing me rant about. I'm tired of talking targeted variable payments here. We really must insist that we start talking pay parity. This isn't about giving investigators more. This isn't about classing anybody as special. This is making sure that people are not worse off for making a career decision here that actually is incredibly vital to how we meet the needs of our victims and how we ensure successful outcomes and high investigative standards. We have to talk pay parity to take that kind of idea of it being a choice for us to be able to pay our investigators to ensure that they are not worse off. We cannot keep playing almost kind of organisational buckaroo here as we kind of see what bits we can take out of different roles and what benefits we can take away, and then be surprised when the pony backs. And I think the pay parity thing for investigators is key. And how we can continue to really look at your CPD and what does that meaningfully look like for you? Things that actually you are concerned about, that you don't feel that you're fully able to embrace or that you aren't confident in stepping into. And how can we support forces in doing that? So we've done lots with the college, lots with forces to help provide CPD toolkits. We've improved our data collation as well around PIP2 because, to be fair, gang, some forces were really, really good at it and all over it, had proper systems for it. Some were doing it on the back of a fag packet, I think. And how we bring everybody to really understand what your PIP2 landscape looks like, who's in those posts, and understand why they're leaving them and where they're going. And also not forgetting our police staff investigators here and how we ensure they have meaningful career pathways, because what we're finding is we are seeing a 5-year churn with some of our investigators, and it's our police staff investigators who become that business continuity within those teams. And well-being. We did a lot of work on understanding what are the challenges for investigators in terms of their well-being. And one of the biggest things that we've done there is the academic reference group, which brings together academic colleagues from not just nationally, but internationally, who are working on very specific well-being issues for detectives. It brings together Soteria, it brings together the VKPP, the Policing Institute of Eastern Region, as well as individual academic colleagues who are working within academic institutions, as well as what are affectionately known as pracademics. So those colleagues amongst us who are undertaking their masters or their PhD, but are touching upon investigator wellbeing. We bring them all together, and we are now starting to develop some work to really understand common minimum standards across all that research. And of course, we introduced the investigator wellbeing toolkit and the week of action. When I first ran that, and the team here will remember, we had about 500 registrations for the week. And I had to push really hard for that. That Investigator Wellbeing Week is not run by Oscar Kilo, it's not run by the NPCC, it's run by me and some volunteers from our Wellbeing Week. We've had to work really hard to get that, a footprint in the national wellbeing landscape. And I'm really proud of it because we've gone from 500 registrations in 2021 to over 4,500 last year. We've got a really engaged YouTube channel where you can access all those recordings. We make sure that everybody gets access to the presentations, and more importantly, we feed back the findings of what you tell us through that week directly to chief constables with an ask and a kind of direction of what they need to do to improve. But for me, I think this is an evolving crisis now, being around this for quite some time. And of course, the challenge has evolved. We now got a 7% vacancy factor, so we've reduced it from 22% to 7%. But I'm sure if I speak to any of you, none of you will tell me you feel well resourced, and so it doesn't feel right. And as I've said, we've got a 5%, we got a 5-year churn with investigators, so the challenge has changed. And for us now as a team, we started to look at, okay, do we understand demand here? And are we confident forces have enough PIP2 posts to meet that demand? And how do we attract and retain into an increased number of PIP2 posts? And so our work is changing. There's lots that we're looking forward to through the future. Some I've just touched upon, some, that we are looking to kind of really kind of hand to forces to say, look, here's some projects, engage in them, developing retention strategies, developing a kind of life cycle of a high risk role, what we should be doing when we attract them in, what we should do throughout that process, and what we do when you retire out. How do we better support you when you come in either to the end of your tenure as an investigator or when you're looking to retire out? There's far more we could and should be doing for those leaving the pathway. So there's lots of work still happening. We've got lots of engagement in each of those subgroups. If you're interested in being part of any of this, my email address is at the end of this. Please get in touch with me because, as I said, we are so fortunate to have brilliant colleagues engaged in this work. And I just want to talk about the wellbeing stuff. I was a bit flippant earlier around wellbeing dogs and so on, which are vital and are a delight to see and to be part of. But what I would say is that these are the academic game changers for what changes the game for wellbeing. And it requires senior leaders to make some really difficult decisions here. So the first thing is to manage and prioritise demand and understanding that demand. So you recognise what is being placed upon your colleagues and understand, do you have enough PIP2 posts for that? And if you do, and you increase that PIP2 post establishment, you're able to enable that time away from work so people can rest, so people can, let things go and are not constantly worried about what they're coming back to every time they're on holidays or picking up the phone during those holidays to make calls to CPS or make calls to victims. Having those meaningful one-to-ones with those supervisors that we talked about, and also investing in reward and recognition. Now, we're really good at commendations and honours, I think, in most forces, and people with shiny gear on handing certificates out, but we're not so good at the informal thank yous. We're losing the art of that, I think. And what our investigators are telling us is that actually all I really want is for senior leaders to recognise the impact this job has on me, that it has on my family, that it has on my work life, that it has on my home life. And even when we don't get that result to court, the massive effort that's gone into all this work and how I carry this with me long beyond that case is closed. And to ensure we engage in your continuous professional development, because it's seen as a way of valuing you as well as making sure that you're able to do your jobs. And these are things we are constantly pushing to our senior leaders in forces and are pushing via the HMIC FRS Investigative Resilience Plan, which all forces have to complete and which they are scrutinised on as part of their appeal inspections. And so we've got a bit of a future focus as well. As I've mentioned, do we understand demand and its impact on our numbers? How do we create an environment that retains colleagues in that PIP2 pathway? And how do we change the wellbeing narrative? So it really focuses on those organisational barriers, not necessarily those other fluffier stuff, but really focusing wellbeing and your wellbeing budgets to mitigate the business risk. Because if you don't, we will continue to lose our investigators. And so I just want to touch upon a few things before I leave you around signs, symptoms, things to look out for. I'm not an occupational health expert by any stretch of the imagination, but we do try and raise awareness here of things you should be looking at because prevention is key. And each one of us has a role within that prevention in understanding ourselves, understanding how we react to things and what we need to do about our own well-being. So secondary trauma, as some may know, it's that kind of trauma that you are exposed to through other people's trauma and is built over time as well and gets worse and worse and worse if not dealt with. And it has some very specific symptoms. They're quite broad and they're quite varied, but each person will have their own individual symptom that they will see and they will pick up on. And it is so easy for us to dismiss some of these. When I have people through the Week of Action sharing their own personal journeys and their own issues around mental ill health, they'll often say, I had no idea this was coming. I had no idea that I was struggling. I was just trying to get through things. And then they go on and list a whole host of these things about, not being able to switch off, about having really difficult dreams, about trying to blocking out and forgetting things, about using alcohol or cigarettes or other substances or points of interest to kind of block out those feelings, not being able to enjoy their lives, feeling isolated from family and friends, that emotional numbing getting in the way of their home life as well as their personal life. And also actually people suddenly lashing out in work, being a lot more short-tempered, being a lot more ratty. Often that's the only thing we pick up is when we pick someone up from a performance issue, thinking, my goodness, someone's, Sarah-Jayne's turn, she's fuming all the time and she's shouting at everybody, let's get it in for a performance chat, rather than perhaps really looking deeper and understanding where this may be coming from. And signs of burnout. Now, burnout tends to be from more that organisational barrier point of view. And these too have their own set of symptoms. And again, I would ask you to familiarise yourselves with these. I sent this presentation to the team and I hope it's shared with you afterwards so that you can access it and you can use these and indeed access the links to further support that's in this presentation. So looking at emotional exhaustion symptoms, please forgive me, I don't know anybody over the age of 35 who isn't exhausted all the time. However, I'm assured this is a very different tiredness. It's that born tiredness where you just haven't got the energy to get out of bed, let alone get up and deal with the day. Avoiding help, not really reaching out to people, feeling that isolation again, just cutting yourselves off and finding it really difficult to be really happy about anything. And actually feeling that you're failing, feeling that you're not doing what you should be doing, feeling incompetent all of a sudden and feeling like, the job's going down the pan and you're going down there with it. I really ask you to kind of identify any of these signs in yourselves or what your triggers are and what it looks like to you. For me, I know the first sign of any of this is I feel like the nerve endings in my teeth are exposed. I get really short, I get really ratty, and I'm an outrageously optimistic person, annoyingly so. And it starts to go the other way. I start getting really grumpy about things. Recognizing that in myself, I know I need to take some time out. I need to step away. I need to find those mitigation techniques that work for me. And this is a really interesting piece of work that came from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who've done lots of work on personal resilience and mitigation. And there's things they suggest that you can do before work, during and after work. And I think some of these are quite personal. Not everybody will enjoy journaling. I'm a terrible meditator or mindfulness. I'm always a million miles ahead of myself. I'm frightened if I start having that stillness, I'll hear the screaming inside. But there are things I think that really interest me that we don't do during work, but optimizing your workspace and ensure that you have reminders of family, friends, happier times around you where you can. Hard to do it in a hot desking area, of course, but there's also other ways. We've got a webinar coming up shortly on optimizing your workspace, I think next month, about if you are viewing distressing images, if you're viewing distressing audio, if you only need to hear the audio, turn the imagery off. If you only need to see the imagery, turn the audio off. Switch things into black and white and make sure you spend no longer than 20 minutes on it at a time and take some time away. Taking those frequent breaks and re-engaging your brain in different ways during that time. They dish out like Where's Wally books, puzzle books, all that kind of stuff, because it kind of switches the way your brain works and takes you out to that kind of trauma, flight or fight experience where you're viewing that distress and stuff. Reach out, pick up a phone, speak to a family member, speak to a friend, do something throughout the day and self-check with yourself every day about how you're feeling. Throughout the day, just checking in, am I particularly stressed? Am I struggling with this now? Do I need to take a break? Because I know we are all guilty of just ploughing through the day so we can get it done and we can get home. And wellness action plans, I've got links to those later. They are really powerful. Do them for yourselves. Wellness support plans, wellness action plans, whatever you want to call it. But it helps you really look at what works for your personal resilience and helps you bring all these things together that we've just talked about and helps you bring them together into one little plan for you so that you can then complete it and share it with your line manager so you can kind of have a bit of a negotiation on what works for you in the workplace. Our Wellbeing of Investigator Toolkit is available to everybody. There's lots of links in there that can support you. And after the last week of action, we got a bit, me and Martin Brunnan, who leads the Investigator Wellbeing piece, he's an ACC in Cambridge, we got really grumpy because people are still telling us that their forces are not paying attention to some of this work. And so we created this and sent it back to all chief constables to say, these are things that your colleagues are saying they're struggling with their well-being, and here's loads of support for you that you can put into place as part of your well-being strategies, as part of your retention strategies. Some of these will be accessible to you as practitioners that you can draw down, like those wellness support plans, like the recordings of masterclasses, like the mindfulness, breath work, and all those other kind of recorded options that you have that you can utilize. Some you can give to your bosses around developing meaningful wellbeing toolkits, meaningful wellbeing strategies, and actually starting to encourage that pay parity discussion and some of those other things that we are looking to do. And that is a real quick whistle-stop tour of a massive piece of work that we are trying to do. As I said, we are so lucky as part of that work because I cannot tell you how many brilliant, engaged, enthusiastic and passionate people we have as part of that work who are trying to make a difference. I've worked on multiple national pieces of work. I've never worked with a group that are quite as passionate as this piece of work, and we are really trying to target it so that we are meeting the needs of what you were telling us are the problems. So if you want to be part of it, let me know and I'll stop talking so you can get on with your day. Go on, both.
Sarah, thank you so much for that presentation, insightful and interesting as always. There is one question in the chat bar from Chris Hobbs from Norfolk. He says, I note that from the NPCC guidance that the following an absence from being a PIP 2 post for more than 3 years, the PIP 2 trained officer is shown as inactive. Do we anticipate more inactive officers within the 5-year churn, and how many PIP 2 officers do we have to train that are currently inactive? So I don't know if you can answer that.
Well, I will say, I don't know the answer to that, to the latter part, because we are really data poor in the central team. We do not get a lot of centralized data around that kind of thing, of how many are inactive. We barely know why people are moving on. So we are really fortunate. We've been engaging with the Workforce Committee, which is a subcommittee in the NPCC, who do have now access to all that data, or are starting to collate that kind of data from forces as part of the regular PIP2 data collation, which I think the Uplift team do every month. So we are looking to have more of that information. And I think what's really interesting for me is it comes down to career pathways as well within forces. So we've been really vocal on, and I thought we had stopped this, but I'm seeing a resurgence of it, of moving people out of the pathway. And you spend all that time training them to be accredited and to do that work, and really starting to minimise how you move people out of the investigative pathway and look at those pathways upwards for them. And of course, if people got, senior leadership ambitions where you might need to be a bit more multifunctional, fine. But that's not what's happening. It's meeting a need elsewhere and just shunting people around, leaving vacancies, training those people up and off they go again. So it's a really fudged answer there, Chris, to your question. And it's based on because we don't really know why people are moving on and what mitigation we can put into place. However, it is something that we are looking at with our Workforce Committee. And we are really keen to understand what kind of mitigation we can put into play, and even some suggestions on how people can maintain accreditation in that time, and how they can perhaps not necessarily kind of fall off the radar then until suddenly we need to bring them back in and they go reaccredit all over again. Hopefully that makes a bit of sense. As I said, it's not a very full answer to you, but it is something we are looking at.
Thank you, Sarah. That's fine, fantastic, and that's a great answer. I've got a question for you, and it's just around what level of support are you getting from chief constables across the NPCC on actually actioning and embedding some of the recommendations that are coming out of the work you're doing?
I'll be perfectly frank. I think it's ad hoc, and I think it very much depends on your makeup of your chief officer team. What you'll find is if you've got a PIP 3, PIP 4 chief constable or DCC somewhere, or who's been through the major crime or that serious organised crime or whatever pathway, the kind of specialist crime pathway, they'll be paying far more attention to this. And it has been a source of frustration for us as a group. Hence why we pulled up that kind of one page to really put through Chief's Net and force it onto people and ensure that it's in the HMIC Investigator Resilience Plan, because it does very much depend on who sat in those decision-making seats, who owns the wellbeing budget, who owns that training budget, and where their pathway is. And, you know, it can be quite frustrating. However, you know, you get the impression, hopefully, that I'm quite noisy. Jason Hogg in Thames Valley is quite noisy about this work as well as the Chief Constable. And it's something that we push really heavily through you guys, through Chief Constable's Council, and through the kind of very visible things that we are doing to try and move this away from, this is the kind of thing you should be doing, to, if you don't do this, there are serious business risks that are going to come across your desk that you are not going to be able to mitigate, you know, particularly around that wellbeing and retention piece. So really turning it away from a wellbeing discussion to a business risk discussion, I think is kind of one of the game changers that we're talking about, and how we reframe this.
Thanks so much for that. I'm so pleased that you brought up the pay parity aspect. It's something that we do discuss a lot, isn't it? And it's such an important point. So that's definitely something that Ben and I are going to cover a little bit in the session with just the two of us in a moment. So there's nothing else in the chat for you, Sarah-Jayne. So thanks again for your time, and always for your support. And it's great working with you. No,
likewise. Thank you all for being engaged in this work, and thank you for inviting me, and have a great day, everyone. I'll see you all soon. Take care. Bye. So, Ben, it's you and I for the next session. So what we're going to do is just speak to you guys for a short time about the forum work that we do as the National Forum, but also going over some of the headlines from the most recent pay and morale survey from a detective's perspective.
So the Police Federation have had a detectives forum for more years than Mel and I can probably remember, and I joined the forum as a Fed rep many years ago, and I can only say it's come on strength to strength since then. We have a representative in every branch now across the country, and since Mel and I have taken over the reins a couple of years ago, we've really pushed hard to enhance the role of detective across the Federation. It encouraged detectives from across the country to join as Fed reps. And I would say that if you look at what makes a really good investigator, tenacity, attention to detail, good communication skills, in that I would say you've got fantastic Fed reps. You've got people who can take an information, use it to better their colleagues' lot and look after them in all of the different Federation thematics we do, including discipline and post-incident, as you heard from earlier. So I'll start by, you know, those of you who are out there who have maybe wondered what the Federation does, contact your local branch. You know, there's vacancies all over the country. We'll be having elections in the next few years. So, you know, do think about the Federation as another string to your bow, and an opportunity to learn more about your local force, learn more about how it's run, and then ultimately be able to put a detective's viewpoint to, which sometimes can quite often be a very uniform-centric area of business, as we've found traditionally. So the Federation, as we say, have the detective forum, and we meet quarterly or by teams with the representatives across the country. And Mel and I put in place a couple of years ago some strategic objectives, because it's very much about, we can all get together and have a chat about things, but we need to see some movement on it. What are we campaigning for nationally? So the current aims and objectives of the forum on your behalf nationally is the impact of the DG6 on policing, enhancing the role of the detective within the Federation, both at a branch level and a national level, and reward and recognition for detectives. Taking the first one, I have been leading the work on the DG6 under the Simplify the DG6 campaign. for the last 2 years. We have made some significant progress, which it was lovely to hear Mr. de Meyer talk about earlier. The Pathfinder project that the Home Office, NPCC and CPS are undertaking. I will claim, I will claim the plaudits for the fact that because of what we've been doing as nationally as a federation, we've pushed them into doing something, and this and looking to how we can stretch the rules around disclosure, around data protection, will ultimately hopefully lead to some positive results. However, I've been negotiating with MPs and peers and the Home Office for over a year now, and I've had drafted on behalf of PFEW a robust and legally sound amendment to the Data Protection Act that would allow all of you to pass unredacted data to the CPS free charge. This was being debated as part of the Data Protection Digital Information Bill that's currently going through Parliament and the Lords, and it was sadly one of the acts that didn't make it through the legislative process before the general election. Now that, I would actually say, I'll tell you today, is probably a good position, because sadly, despite all of our negotiation, the current government just haven't been prepared to support it. They haven't given us any legal reasons why it can't be supported. There just seems to be a lack of political will to support this. On a number of occasions, I've met with the Shadow Home Secretary and the Shadow Policing Minister, who might well very soon be the Home Secretary and the Policing Minister. So when Parliament resumes, we'll look at who the new government is, and I'll once again start the negotiations on your behalf, because I do feel, whilst the Pathfinder project I'm sure will be a success, as your federation, I want you to be legally protected. I want it in law that you can do this, because then no one criticise you. The IOP, that's you can't be investigated for data breaches. We won't have the Information Commissioner's Office looking at individuals, looking at chief constables for breaching data protection rules. But that requires a change in the law and political will. But as your federation, we will continue to fight for that, and we will keep you updated on all developments. Mel and I will also be working with Mr. de Meyer's office around the Pathfinder project. And once we know which forces and areas are taking part, we're going to be visiting. We want to hear from the front line how this is working, what are the issues, because then we can go back and report it. The next bit of work that we are really keen on moving forward is exactly what Sarah-Jayne said, pay parity. And this is where I need your help. I need you to tell me what you want us to fight for. We don't want TVPs. We don't want target variable payments that then run a postcode lottery up and down the country as to whether chief constables can or want to find the money to pay detectives more. We can't have detectives who can, who have to move roles back into uniform roles because they simply can't afford to put food on their table or put petrol in their car. So what do you want? Please use the chat bar, use the email address, tell us what you want. Do you want a bonus payment for detectives put into police regulations? Do you want non-uniform allowance back? What do you want? We will fight for you. We've already started negotiations with the National General Secretary of the Federation to talk about what we want to try and get into the next pay submissions. We need to know what you want, because then we can fight for it. So either today, use the chat bar and we can discuss it, or contact your local branches, or contact me or Mel. Tell us what you want us to fight for, because being a detective is a role that you have to earn through qualification. You have to maintain through CPD, through proving that you can maintain that level. You shouldn't be at a disadvantage. I loved Sarah-Jayne's slide about all the things you lose from being a detective. We want to nurture detectives. We want our colleagues across the police service to want to be detectives again. There used to be waiting lists to join CID, safeguarding units, because people would wanted to do it away from uniform. We're now seeing time and time again people wanting to leave investigative roles because of the workloads, because of the stress, because of the lack of pay parity. So as your federation, use this opportunity, tell us what you want, we will fight for it. So I think that sort of covers where we are as a federation, and I'll hand over to Mel with the pay and morale survey.
Yeah, lovely, thanks, Ben. That really does lead on quite nicely to the pay and morale survey headlines. We're going to deal with the survey in a bit more detail, our forum meeting next month, for those of you that are forum members on the event today. But the biggest ones really for me and for Ben and I just chatting really this morning about it, we found that the responses from the detectives was really good from the survey. So 27% of all responses were from detectives, and that covered all the federated detective ranks. So 7,683 responses were from detectives. So covering that pay and remuneration that we've just been discussing, 78% of those that responded said they were dissatisfied with their basic pay, with 85% actually feeling worse off than 5 years ago, and 16%, so that's around the 1,200 mark, saying they never or almost never had enough money to cover all essentials. Now that just can't be right as a police officer and as a detective. So we know that the cost of living is affecting people all over the country. And there was space on the survey for some free text. I'm just going to cover that by reading from this particular section. So we can see it is all over the country with bills increasing. So water bills increased, car insurance increased, council tax increased, mortgages increasing 30%, of which I cannot cover on my wage. And that was from a detective in the northwest of England. Then from the southeast of England, the cost of childcare has also increased twofold. I would be better off leaving the police to care for my children. And then somebody from the Greater London area. ULEZ expansion has meant I had to scrap my perfectly usable car. I now can't afford another without getting a substantial loan. Therefore, I have to pay for trains, taxis and zip cars, all of which are increasing in price. I feel trapped. So, you know, that's just a snapshot of up and down the country. So moving on to morale, 87% felt morale within the force was low or very low, with almost everyone citing treatment from the government as a reason, followed by treatment by the public and then pay. Reasons for not applying for promotion. People are seeing inspectors' workloads as high and working in their own time, and the pay is just not sufficient to go from a detective sergeant up to a detective inspector. And most worryingly, certainly for me, is that 22% of respondees, so around the 1,700 mark, intend to resign within 2 years or as soon as they can from policing. 96% of respondees said that during a 4-week period they'd worked unpaid overtime, and 83%, just going back to some wellbeing points that Sarah-Jayne was making, 83% indicated they'd experienced feelings of stress, low mood, anxiety, or other difficulties with their health and well-being over the last 12 months. So it's not great reading at all, and or even to listen to those sort of headlines being spoken about. But that's where we are, and that's come, you know, direct from you detectives out there working day in, day out.
And we'll use this data with your local branches. We'll ask your local detective reps and leads to use it to go into your heads of crime, to understand the position in your force. But it's probably a timely reminder to everyone, when you do get that email for that pay and morale survey, which will come out again later in the year, please fill it in. It's really valuable data that we across the Federation can use. We can hold chief constables to account against it, because it's a true representation of how you're feeling. And I am delighted that 25% of the respondees were detectives. And I think that, you know, if you look across our numbers across the country, that's a very fair and clear voice that's heard. So there's nothing in the chat at the moment. So there's no questions at this time. But just to reflect on sort of some of the pay parity stuff, I think it's important to oh, we have a attendee with a hand up.
Got a hand
I
up.
think we can bring someone in.
Can we bring Tracy in? Oh, it's gone down. I don't know whether you want to just pop your point in the chat. I think it was Tracy.
Yeah, I think it was. Well, we have a
Or Natasha
with her hand up. Bring Natasha in.
Thank you.
Natasha, can you hear us? No.
Hello, can you hear me?
Oh, we have a few
Hello.
hands up. I don't know if we can bring anyone in.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear her.
Oh,
Sorry.
need to sort out our.
Thank you. I just wanted to say I don't have a chat option, and you mentioned very quickly at the beginning. So I'm hearing lots of people put in chat, but I'm wondering how many people want to put in some feedback but can't because there's no chat option.
Yeah, no, completely understand. And we did say at the start that if you've got any feedback and you can't put it in the chat, please put it into send it into events@polfed.org, and we can we can certainly get back to people.
Thank you.
Or in fact, they can put your question onto the chat on your behalf.
Yeah. Anyone else would like to say anything? This is your opportunity. No, Tracy. Tracy, can you?
Yeah, I was just trying to unmute. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can, Tracy. Yeah, hi.
It was exactly the same thing. I was going to say the exact same thing, but then I was like, I don't know what happens when I raise my hand. So could you just go with the email address, please?
Yeah, of course.
Again, because I didn't catch it at the beginning.
Yeah, we've popped it.
They can't see the chat.
So it's
I can't see anything on the chat. Yeah.
No, so it's events, the word events at polfed.org.
Brilliant.
Events
Thank you very much.
Events@polfed.org. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we will move now on to the next session, which is a wellbeing session with our good friend from PFEW, our National Wellbeing Lead, Paul Williams. Welcome, Paul.
Thanks very much, Ben and Mel. It's been very informative so far, and some very sobering but not surprising stats that have come out and issues that have been raised that again is something that we find from a national board perspective incredibly frustrating on behalf of the members. Just covering a couple of points so far said before going to the Ask Twice campaign that we are running. And these are very important and linked to the campaign. Some of the things that Sarah-Jayne covered are incredibly relevant and nationally concerning for us, and pay parity being one. But some of the points raised, mandated support is something that I asked very strongly for at the Home Affairs Select Committee last month. If we haven't got mandated wellbeing support throughout all 43 forces, then it's inevitable that all 43 forces are going to do things completely differently, and it becomes a postcode lottery whether we get looked after correctly or not. And again, it's a strong leadership or more educated leadership about some of the symptoms and signs of mental ill health. And you find supervisors quite frequently using performance regulations to deal with certain issues that we have. And this is entirely the wrong way to do it. So without learning how to recognise all symptoms, then we end up adversely breaking our cops, and they go off long-term sick. And as Sarah-Jayne quite rightly said, create a huge business risk. And I hear so frequently chief constables using a hierarchy of preference really in dealing with policing, and that is public first, organisation second, and members and staff last, which to me is a completely upside down approach, because if we don't look after our members, then we won't have an organisation fit to look after the public. It's as simple as that, and that business risk is very real. And the words are used in giving evidence to the select committee last month were, in relation to mental health, is complete crisis. Our cops are in crisis, and policing is therefore in crisis. So it is obviously very relevant to the Ask Twice campaign that we set up. That as a national board, we made a decision last year to start a mental health campaign, and with a lot of background work from myself and my colleagues, we have then recently opened up and seen the birth of the Ask Twice campaign, and we are hoping that this is long term. This can be bespoke, not just to the Police Federation nationally, but to all branches across the country, because different branches and different areas offer different realms of support. So we can move on to next slide, please. So in setting up the campaign, we wanted something meaningful, however achievable, to get through the objectives, to set the objectives basically for what we want to put forward. And that's under the 4 strands of wellbeing. So we want to provide all the assets that we have, and there are many of them, for the members to have that confidence and to initiate positive conversations, whether that be with colleagues, supervisors, chief officers, or any member of staff. Because Ask Twice, the whole theme behind this is basically when we ask someone if they're okay or if they're all right, that's now become a greeting as such. And it's almost become normal to say to somebody, "You okay? Yes, are you? Great." And then we walk past each other. But asking that question twice, saying, "No, really, are you okay?" Can promote a conversation and really delve into the depths of what somebody is really feeling and what they are going through. And we also want to highlight the work that PFEW offers, but also other agencies, and more importantly as well, in force areas, as Sarah-Jayne has pointed out there are many people in force areas, many members who have taken up responsibility themselves and created real positive networks of well-being that we want to promote and we want to support. So having all this in one place, because when we looked at this, we thought all of these things on our website that's positive, you know, your Oscar Kilo, your PTCs, everything, it was a scatterblast approach across various different pages on the website, quite hard to find. And we wanted to bring all of this together under one page, or one click of a button, or a QR code, and allow branches or members to have full access to this and have a user-friendly, easy to find approach to what is actually out there, because what you realize, there is more help than we see, or than we think. And we want to embed that culture of asking twice. So as I've said before, is we need it to become a habit. And yes, of course, the workplace, chief constables as effectively employers have that ultimate legislative responsibility over the well-being of our officers, but it's not just their responsibility. We're all responsible for each other, for our colleagues, and we should all be responsible enough to ask twice, to spot the signs, to identify when somebody is at a point that are very low in their career or even the personal lives. And we wanted to use the 4 pillars of wellbeing, which we'll go through shortly, for building that framework, because there are 4 pillars of wellbeing as we'll go through. If we go on the next slide, please. Thank you. as you can see, the 4 pillars there that are relative to mental ill health. Every single pillar there, if there's problems in each one, then it can affect your mental health and how we cope with ourselves at work. So this is a first time, really, a first time thing for us all, is to bring everything together and signpost everything under one banner on the Ask Twice campaign. And it's a moving beast, the Ask Twice campaign. It's a growing beast that we can evolve with, we can use, we can adopt, amend, and we can keep adding as well to all the strands of wellbeing that we have. So if we go to the next slide, please. So obviously, when we identify certain elements of mental health or low mood in our cops, these are generally the drip feeding signs of somebody who is not quite right, somebody who is struggling. That's the lower extreme. There is, unfortunately, the higher extreme, and as we know, cops are taking their own lives out there. Mental ill health is a killer. It is killing our cops, young cops as well. And there always is that point where some of our cops, and I've been unfortunate to have to represent some members who are in complete crisis and do attempt suicide, whether they discuss it, whether they make real attempts, whether they hide medication in places, whether they carry out that ultimate act. And that is a time in crisis where the Federation rep and we as members and colleagues cannot deal with. We're not qualified to do so. So before going on to this Ask Twice page, we've come straight to this, and if we need help now, one click of that button, it will take you straight to the elements or the departments we need to refer to, such as the NHS, ultimately, if we're in crisis, the Samaritan, somebody that can really help. And as has just been kicked off by the Covenant, there is a crisis line, as promised by the Home Secretary at last conference, for police officers, which has been piloted in North East now, a 24/7 crisis line that does offer counselling. So there are points where sometimes we just cannot help and we have to refer to a crisis unit or a crisis team, and this will take you there. If we go on to the next one, please. What we can do, if we move on to number 4, so it's all highlighted, and we'll quickly go through them. So the 4 pillars of well-being, not surprisingly, mental, physical, financial, and general. As we've discussed, certainly from the detectives and the pay parity issues, financial is a big issue that can really get our detectives down, any of our cops down into the dumps of mental ill health. Again, physical well-being, if we have an injury on duty, for example, or off duty, disability, something that's quite debilitating if you've had an active life, and you're having to go through realms of treatment to get up to speed to be able to function properly, can really affect your mental health. And again, general well-being, so anything that is low on the ebb that can affect how you function at work and how you mentally cope, and can drag you down into distress. And so hence the Ask Twice, why we want to bring the 4 pillars of well-being into one. And as this campaign develops, we'll be doing seminars and inputs on each one. Financial, certainly physical, one that we've just recently introduced on opening the campaign, and really taking a deep dive into what the causes are and what we can do. Next slide, please. Thank you. So these are some of the things on the website. Once you scan the QR code and you go into it, there is a hub for cost of living support, suicide support, bereavement support, trauma support, and toolkits. And we're doing a lot of work nationally on suicide and trauma. There are some forces that are leading in this and doing incredibly well, and some very supportive chief constables are prioritising this. And again, as we'll go back to what Sarah-Jayne said, and as I've recently given evidence in, it's a postcode lottery. It's where you are. You shouldn't have to go to one particular force to get a level of support which you absolutely deserve, and not find it in your own force. It's beyond belief. We need at least a common minimum standard and mandated approach for forces to deal with well-being. And yes, it's a struggle. It's an uphill struggle with 43 forces, but it's something we want to strive for. Next slide, please. In developing the campaign, we got some banners. You will see these banners up at Bravery, and also you are, for example, my home force chief constable is going to be using one of these in a policing week, or a road show that he's doing. He'll be attending various stations, various locations, putting these banners up. And there's email footers, and there's hundreds, well, we've got thousands of stickers printed, sending them out to forces. If you want some, please just let us know. We'll get them sent out to you, with the QR code on, so you can attach them to anything. And if you need to access at any point, then you can just scan that QR code and it'll take you straight to the Ask Twice website. Next slide, please. We're promoting the campaign, and any of you as members can join in by promoting it. We are basically have some cue cards, some banners that we are with a message of Ask Twice on the back and the QR code, and we are taking pictures, asking chief officers to get involved in support of the campaign. Any celebrities and any person really who wants to take a picture and send it in. We really want to get the message across that this isn't a game, this isn't a gimmick. This is policing in crisis. This is mental health on a very low ebb of police officers. And if we want to continue policing for the public, then we need to promote this, and we need to start sending that message out and getting the message across to the government to start being realistic on how we deal with our cops in crisis. Next slide, please. So very quickly, the timeline that we did before we in launch. So we did a soft launch 1st to the 13th of May, where we're pulling the website together. And in World Mental Health Week, we wanted to launch the campaign in that week because it was very timely. And on the 15th of May, that's where we launched the webinar with you'll have seen in the break the desk exercises, the chair exercises and such like. For those sat at the desk, need to keep moving and try and increase that physical activity. Even if it's just a bit, it makes a difference. But as I've said, it's a growing campaign. It's developing all the time. And I've had contact from members personally with various networks that they've set up personally, with links to those networks, and asked for it to be put onto the website. And by all means, that is welcome, because we want to show the members what is actually out there. One thing I haven't mentioned is that when you go into the website, you can pick your force area. So, for example, myself, I'm from Cumbria. If I select Cumbria on there, it will come up with all the support, help and access to whatever is bespoke to that area. So what we did find is some forces offer different means, different networks, and that is unique and bespoke. And if those forces want something adding or taking off, if they contact us, we can facilitate that, no problem at all. So we didn't just want this to be our campaign from the National Police Federation. We want it to be your campaign as well from the members. And as Ben quite rightly said, we need the members' voice. So if we need to promote and fight for something that's relevant to the membership, we need that member's voice to do so. It's incredibly relevant. I think that's it now. Basically an Ask Twice campaign, and there's a lovely picture of myself and Haley, who is the co-lead, the wellbeing co-lead with myself, holding the Ask Twice banner. And anyone wants to take a picture or selfie of yourselves doing so, do it, send it in, and we'll add it onto the website. So open up to questions or discussions for anybody.
Thanks, Paul. Great presentation, as always. Such a really important topic to discuss, and I really appreciate you making some time to do it today, because I think it's right that our detective and investigator colleagues across the country hear it. And you know, the work that you're doing will hopefully, you know, even if it assists one person, can make that difference. And I think that's where we've got to come with it. So there's no, you've escaped with no questions in the chat, but we'll see if anyone is wanting to ask anything. You're welcome to pop your hand up or come in. And Amy Fox. Amy Fox, you should be able to speak. We should be able to hear you if you speak, Amy.
Oh, there we go. Can you hear me now?
We can. Hello.
I don't know if it's more of an observation than a question, but I work in the world of child abuse, sadly, and I feel like we police, like we deal with our staff, really, where we're very incident driven, we're very incident led. We've got lots of processes to support a specific incident, but we don't look at the cumulative effect. We don't look at the, you know, is there a way of, you know, producing some kind of tick box, you know, when you go to a particularly traumatic incident, which cumulatively keeps a record almost, because I think that's where we probably fall foul slightly, is we don't look at that long-term effect of going to multiple traumatic incidents and over years of dealing with stressful traumatic investigations.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. It's really good and very relevant as well. And as detectives, not just attending traumatic incidents, but suffering from the vicarious trauma as well, for looking at these images and you're doing this day in, day out, and it's an incredibly traumatic job that is very hard to hold down, especially if you have children at home yourself. What we are doing, we've pushed for, you'll have heard of Up Hampshire, where we've been measuring and obtaining stats on police assaults. We have agreement by all forces to adopt Up Hampshire. There has been some negligible comeback with regards to how the stats are handled due to software issues and things like that, but we are getting some data back. Well, phase 2 of Up Hampshire is to start measuring and tracking trauma. So it's basically a software package, a trauma tracker, and we are sampling this in Cumbria very soon. So our Chief Constable Rob Carden has agreed to adopt this into his computer IT system and have a trauma tracker, which any traumatic incident itself, an officer can even self-report going to an incident. It doesn't have to be triaged. And then we gain those stats, we gain the data that it takes to measure that drip feeding trauma that cops get. Yeah, one incident might not affect you too much, but you go to 100 and you come out being a completely different person. So it's an incredibly good point to make, and something that we are working on. We're hoping to adopt in all forces, and it would be very interesting to see those results. So thank you, Tracy.
Thank you.
And just to follow on from that, I know there's some really good work that's been done around storm data in Surrey, in Sussex and Derbyshire have adopted that. Myself and my colleagues in Norfolk Federation are working with our chief officers looking at different options around trauma tracking. We've had a meeting with Microsoft, and there's some interesting products that they can offer that can sit easily on force networks because of the platforms most forces look at. And the benefit, I would say, of having it wider than just Storm or whatever your command and control system is that from an investigative perspective, people can be added onto it. But again, that needs to be balanced again about how much additional more work is that's going to be for supervisors, because people need to be actually added to the tracker. But some of the products I've seen, some of the examples, it's really good because it is that drip, 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 and actually it will trigger those conversations. And one of the discussions I'm having certainly with Norfolk and Suffolk is around, what does this mean? This is management information that we will get. What are we going to do with it? Are we going to be really brave and make some really difficult decisions on behalf of other people, such as, do you know what, you're going to be moved, at worst case, you're going to be moved out of your role for 6 months and you're going to be given a completely different role because we don't want you to break. That could be really difficult for some colleagues because they love what they do, but it's about that greater good, and it's about that vicarious liability that our chief constables hold. And sometimes we need to make decisions for people or change the culture, work to change the culture so people aren't afraid of saying, do you know what, I am a bit broken, this is affecting me, because they don't want to leave their role. And I think it's this open conversations, which, the work that you're doing, Paul, will really further. So thank you. I think we've got Tracy. Tracy, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, sorry, it's me again. I just thought I'd mention that I'm employed by West Mercia Police, and in relation to traumatic incidents, we now are encouraged to report that via accident at work or near miss reporting system. So we do have a way of tracking it within our force area. I'm not sure how recently that was set up, but I know that it does exist as part of the drop down menu where you can tick that you've been to a traumatic incident.
That's another really important thing you've said, Tracy, because we have wrote to all forces from the National Federation. We've asked how they monitor and how they document traumatic or mental ill health with officers, and do they do it or accept doing it on as an injury at work, where some forces are incredibly good at doing that, and clearly that's one of the good practices that your force has adopted. Other forces actively discourage mental ill health or trauma to be documented as an injury at work, which is very disappointing. So again, it's something that we want to look at through the covenant and try and, if not mandate, get some best practice put in there.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. And it picks up on a point, Paul, from the chat from Gary from Sussex, says that tracking trauma is great, but the forces have an obligation to deal with this trauma. They have responsibilities under this health and safety to assist officers, and I think that hit the nail on the head, hasn't it?
Great point. Yeah, and we've, as a wellbeing group, we've recently merged with our health and safety lead as well. So we're working together from a health and safety and wellbeing perspective to try and look at how we can potentially hold forces to account if they are not making a safe working environment or safe place for our cops to work in. Then we can't expect the cops to do the job, and potentially look at how we can hold them civilly liable. Not that we want to do this, obviously the last resort, but what we need is accountability. As you've mentioned, Ben, we need absolute accountability for the well-being of our cops.
Thank you. And there are some other, there's a point here around the workloads of detectives causing stress, and that's a very good point there from Alison. And to answer your question, there's no limit. The APP on investigations doesn't say what a caseload looks like. It's down to that professional judgment of supervisors and managers. But that's a really good point you make, and something that we can certainly take back with our college lead, Paul Matthews from the Federation, who I'm sure can look at that and tie it in, because it's a common thread, isn't it? If your workload's unmanageable, you get stressed. But if we look at even when the APP does dictate things such as Mosovo, the amount of the number of high risk, low, medium, and low risk offenders that people should be managing, forces are breaching this all the time because there's too many offenders to manage than there are resources in the department. So it is that professional, but ultimately it comes down to that. Forces have a legal responsibility under health and safety to make sure you're all safe and well and okay at work. So it's an ongoing battle, and really pleased, Paul, that you've had a chance to speak to us today. So thank you so much for your time. We move towards lunch. There are a number of other questions in the chat bar that we will get to them all. Certainly some of the ones that people have emailed in now around some of the detective stuff we mentioned early. So we'll wrap them all up at the end of the day after the last session. Please go and have
we've got a quick video.
I was going to say, so there's a quick video from Chief Constable Jason Hogg that we're going to play you, and when that finishes, I'll just come back and say close the session for lunch, and we'll explain what the afternoon will be. So very quick video from Chief Constable Jason Hogg.
Every day, our officers and staff face extraordinary circumstances and deal with tough situations. It's all of our responsibility to look out for each other. The times in my career where people have said to me, "Are you okay?" And I've said yes, when in reality I haven't been. So next time you ask a colleague if they're okay, please mean it, and ask twice. Are you okay? Are you really okay?
Hi, welcome back everybody. Hope you had a good lunch. Right, next up, Ben and I are just going to have a chat with our Detective of the Year winner, Laura Corscadden from Thames Valley Police. Welcome, Laura.
Hi, good afternoon. Welcome.
Hi, Laura. Thanks for joining us today, and just thought it would be fantastic to, as part of the seminar, for you to be present as our Detective of the Year award winner last year. Laura was nominated by her superintendent for the Detective of the Year award, and it was by far one of the most outstanding applications we've ever had, and rare, because we very rarely have anyone above the rank of DS nominated. It's normally DCs and DSs, quite rightly. So it was really lovely to see that Laura's inspirational leadership was recognised by her superintendent, and I think a very worthy winner of last year's award. So Laura, give us tell us what it was like to win.
Thank you. It's been incredible. I think it's still sinking in, if I'm honest, but it's something I'm incredibly proud of, and I think it's something I'm going to be proud of the rest of my career. And I think what's nice is that this is now forever going to be a bit of a freeze frame for me, capturing a time with an incredible team, some incredible individuals, the culture, the ethos, and what we achieved together. I'm going to remember that now for the rest of my career. And I think what's important as well is it's that recognition and reward piece, and none of us are immune to that at any level, any rank, and it's been hugely impactful to me. It's given me a real sense of self-belief. It's kind of reinforced, what matters, that you're making a difference, and really sort of boosting to continue that. And it makes a huge impact, and I think it really enforces for me that piece around reward and recognition at every level, and especially from a detective side. I think quite often we do work and it's taken as you do good work and that's what you do, but to be recognised and it is such a collective effort.
And since winning, what's happened since?
Lots, as is always the way. So since the award, I was working really hard in preparation for promotion, and again that sort of mentoring, support and development piece is really important. And I don't think it didn't hurt my cause to win the award just before that process, but it again really reinforced that belief for me going into that promotion process. So I'm really pleased to say I was successful at the promotion process, and I've been posted to a department which is a a dream job for me. So ever since being a detective, it's been a real career aspiration for me to work in major crime. So I'm sat next to one of the other major crime SIOs who's presenting next, and there's an incredible legacy here in Thames Valley in our major crime unit, and I'm honoured to be here. So I've just started in this role, so I've got a new team, a whole new sort of setup, lots of growth for me to prepare and to develop, and I'm really excited, looking forward to it, and also continuous development's a really big piece for me. So the other area that I was working on in the meantime was I'd applied for the FBI National Academy. And again, very pleased to say that I was successful. So next year I'll be going to Quantico in September. So I'll be spending 10 weeks at their National Academy, which is an incredible opportunity. I think now is a really key time for leadership. So the opportunity to learn, to bring things back so I can be the best for my teams, for the force. So yeah, a lot's happened. And I think the award was a real catalyst and a key point for me in that self-belief piece more than anything else. So thank you for the recognition.
Oh, you're welcome, Laura. So an aspect of your nomination that I really liked was around your approach to mentoring and staff development. So would you be able to just share some points around that that you did?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's something I'm really passionate about. It's really important to me. I get a real satisfaction and reward in seeing people develop, in fulfilling their potential and watching their confidence grow, watching them achieve things that, I think they weren't sure they were going to be able to do. And I think that's so key around the detective role, that you don't know what you're capable of, what you can achieve, the impact that you can have. And I think probably some of the most important things that you can do is give people your time and show your interest and develop and support them. And I think I've got a couple of principles around mentoring and development that I try and bring to every role that I do and team that I do. And I think the starting point for me is always around those one-to-ones, sort of getting to know your teams, understanding them, what motivates them, what they want to develop, how they want to be supported, what they need from you. And I think what's important to them outside of work as well. We don't come to work in a vacuum. We've got things that are really important to us, and understanding that as a leader or a supervisor makes a key difference to then how you can continue to develop them. And I think the next sort of stage from that is that kind of practical learnings, that role modelling. People learn a lot just through watching other people lead jobs. I think your briefings and your debriefings around jobs and investigations is really key, and just making sure you've got that environment where people feel they can contribute their ideas, that we can learn, that we can talk about what went well, what we can do better next time. And I think by role modelling and being really visible with your leadership around things like that helps that sort of practical development. And I think alongside that, having a really inclusive team environment, it's that collaboration. And I think that's one of the big selling points about being a detective, is being able to work as a team and what you collectively achieve together. And I think recognising everybody's strengths, bringing that together, and then bringing that peer learning. So ultimately, you can't be there all the time, and bringing a team together to learn from each other is really key in that sort of same development piece. And I think finally, that responsibility on leaders and supervisors to put things in place overall around people's CPD, their accreditation, their training, their reward and recognition, their well-being. And if you're looking ahead for them, then they know that you're looking out for those opportunities for them. You're making sure they've got the skills, the training. Ultimately, people want to come to work and do a good job and have the skills, the time and the support to do that. And I see it as that kind of holistic approach to developing people. But I think putting people at the centre of everything we do and giving them our time, it doesn't cost anything, it's difficult, but that's what people appreciate the most, and that's underpinning everything for me.
And one of the things that stood out for me from your from the application was that the nurturing and development of future detectives that you've done, and I believe you've developed the Aspiring Detectives Development Programme within TVP. Can you give the audience a bit of an idea about that?
Not just me, like I say, it's a real collective effort, but there's work that we did locally, and then there's work that I've done sort of in force. So locally, yes, we did sort of design and pull together an Aspiring Detective Development Programme. One of my DS's, his brother produced a piece of artwork, and it was through that collective effort that we've designed what would be like an attachment and a mentor programme. I think we really noticed during COVID, when people weren't carrying out attachments, they just really didn't understand what being a detective was like, what being in that environment was like. So the attachments and the mentor piece was really important. So we were looking at mentorships, attachments, and then that helped with that talent spotting. don't underestimate the importance of that. So when we're reviewing jobs and you see something really key, a piece of body worn where they've done a fantastic job, and a case where later down the line that piece of body worn's critical, going back to them to say, do you realise that was key in that case? And if you thought about being a detective, what inspires you, what motivates you? So locally, we were looking at that recognition piece around investigations of the month, the talent spotting, the attachments. And then it was sort of from that I then took on a sort of force role within our crime academy. I could probably talk entirely about our crime academy and how valuable that is around the detective piece, but I'm not sure I've got time. But I'm one of the strand leads around recruitment. So one of the things we tried to do, because you could see what the barriers were locally, and we wanted to sort of try and affect that across the whole force itself. So with the introduction of the Crime Academy, which came in, I think it was about 3 or 4 years ago, and we had about, I think it was like up to 99 vacancies. It's a real big kind of gap in our establishment, and we, did a lot of work to understand what were the barriers to people applying to be a detective, and it was things around, the lack of understanding around the process, the money, the kind of the stress, and people feeling they couldn't, they didn't have the skills or the confidence to do it. So through the Crime Academy and through sort of business case proposals, we managed to change the process so that people didn't have to have sat the exam to apply, so that you could apply and then sit the NIE with the support of your team. We put in place study packages, crammer courses, a hard to fill payment for those teams that were working incredibly hard because they were under-resourced and in areas that were quite difficult to recruit into. We also sort of did specific recruitment events and worked really hard to make sure that we could encourage people and be a point of contact for people wanting to be detectives. We redesigned a tutor programme specifically for detectives and detective tutors and constables, because again, that's been really critical to the success of people being detectives and wanting to remain to be detectives. And through the setup of the Crime Academy, we've now got professional leads across the force that look at those key areas, so be it recruitment, retention, accreditation, CPD, training, reward and recognition, well-being. So it's clear to everybody in the force this is a real priority for us, and we've got professional leads. Our Crime Academy's got webinars and libraries, so in your own time you can go and you can sort of self-brief and develop. So it's a really good message, and it's been something that's been really beneficial. So we're now in the position that we actually paused our last recruitment window. We do still have vacancies, but that's more kind of natural movement. But we've made a significant impact in that, in that establishment gap. I think there's a real need for leaders at the moment, with the uplift, the opportunities and things that brings. We are obviously seeing a lot of inexperience. So it's never been more important for us to be really really energetic and enthusiastic about recruiting people, retaining people, inspiring people into these roles, and the support and level of development that we need to put in place is really key at this point. So you can't be passive. You've got to really sort of reach out to people and encourage them and support them to move into this sort of detective world. So it's been really positive, and I think the Crime Academy is a really key role in that, and I've been really grateful to be involved in that.
That's great. Thanks, Laura. We've heard today a lot about well-being. So tell us your thoughts on detective welfare and well-being.
So I think, and I know I've sort of touched on it about having professional leads. So we've got a DCI in force who looks specifically at detective wellbeing and how we can support. So we've got force-wide kind of wellbeing weeks. I think it's been really beneficial to really embed that STIP and demobilise and diffuse training for it. I think that's been really, really key. And I think a lot has changed and developed. I think for me, welfare is such a holistic thing that it's not just the specific investigations, it's around that whole holistic approach of if people feel valued, supported, and if we're looking at all of those strand areas, so people feel trained, they've got opportunities, and they're all interlinked, aren't they? So I think if you're working on recruitment and you've got more people in the office, then there's more workload to share and those things. So understanding all the things that impact wellbeing, and I think there's never been a better focus at the moment, which is really positive. A lot of the things that we've brought through in the wellbeing weeks, and again the things that we've got available to people in terms of support. We've got so many support groups and networks. I've done quite a bit of work within our sort of investigation teams around neurodiversity and really getting the value out of people and showing them what adjustments we can make and how we can get the best out of them and how they can get the best out of the organisation. So it's so holistic, everything's interconnected, and if you've got a really good approach across the board, then I think it can't just be one sort of thing to work on around wellbeing. But I think recognising the importance of those one-to-ones, I think that's the critical part for me, is to always being able to understand and know what's impacting your teams.
No, that's Laura, that's fantastic. Thank you. And you know, really pleased that you've moved into a role that you've always wanted to do. You know, I think I always thought as a young detective, you know, the aspiration must be to lead a murder, and you know, into the, you know, to lead the investigation into someone's death. I think is the most serious thing we can do as detectives, because of the loss and the impact of that death on those who are left behind. So I think I'm really pleased that you've managed to get that role, and congratulations on everything you've done. Is there anyone online who would like to ask Laura any questions? We have a couple of minutes. We've got one that says, let's have a quick look, read of it. Re Detective Academy recruiting and officers entering PIP2 roles without NIE. How long and how did you mitigate the risk of those officers carrying DC workloads when not PIP2 qualified? I'll ask you the first one.
Okay, so yes, they're obviously with the PIP2 accreditation, they can't carry certain jobs without that kind of supervision and risk assessment. So as soon as they entered into the department, they're sort of tutored and they aren't picking up those jobs, and we support them with that study package. So as soon as we know they're coming into the department, that's when the crammer course, getting the study package and getting them onto the NIE. So it is something that we're balancing within the departments. So not picking up those investigations, supporting them through the exam. And I think that's probably the best way to help them, when we can actually set that time aside for them to be focusing on their study, getting through the exam. So no quick answer, but it's a balancing act in terms of supporting them, risk assessing them, but then helping them through the exam. So it's a lot of the time when they're first being posted, we would look at your heat maps and your resilience maps across the force. So if they are going straight into a department that is carrying a lot of those investigations, what we would predominantly do is try and move people through to PCT, our sort of priority crime teams, so that they can learn their tradecraft before they're moving into some of the more complex areas. So we would try and manage their transition and their development that way whilst they're sitting their exam and moving through that way.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. And the last bit of the question is, how long would TVP expect to retain officers in PIP2 roles without passing the exam?
So it's generally been a sort of two attempt at the exam sort of process. And so because when you first sit the exam, which is when you get your study books and your crammer course, so we put all the support in and, you know, try and assist them in passing the exam. We've actually got a really good pass rate. I can't remember the exact stats, but we've been quite consistently high in terms of our NIE pass rate. And I think that is based on the crammer course, the study package, and being able to nurture and support them in those investigative teams at the time. We have said it is a sort of 2 attempt at the exam, but I know we've had to sort of manage that because there's sometimes been different things that are impacting people at different times. So if, you know, something's happening in their life that's meant that either at that second attempt at the exam they've not been successful, or if there's a particular area to help them, but it's not been a specific issue. We've not had people that we've had to say, we can't stay on the department because you've not passed the exam. That's not been an issue we've had, and I think that's because of the support we've put in around the study package. Sorry, I can't hear. Just gone.
Sorry, that's me not putting
the
mic back on. Just like, thank you for answering that. Is there any more questions for Laura whilst we've got her? No, I can't see any hands up, but just brings me to say, Laura, thank you for giving up your time today. Thank you for sharing your experience. Once again, congratulations on winning the Detective Award, and I look forward to speaking to the next National Detective of the Year next year when we launch the awards later in the year. So thank you for your time.
No, thank you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Laura.
Bye.
Okay, thanks very much.
Well, that brings us to the conclusion of today's webinar. I really hope you've enjoyed it. Just to touch on a couple of points that I said we'd come back to. We had some colleagues put some bits in the chat earlier around the reward and recognition things, and just to pick up on a couple of those. One of the questions was around, well, what was there? There's lots of new direct entries and people who've not been investigators for long, and what was they used to? Well, I mean, there's never actually been anything. So the title of detective or the qualification is not recognised within police regulations, and therefore one of the things that we want to do on your behalf is to try and push for that recognition. Now, whether that be that it's the PIP 2, PIP 3, PIP 4 accreditation, whether that's recognised in the fact that if you do any form of exam to do your job, should you get an enhanced payment. So the things that were there before was special priority payments. They've gone. Targeted variable payments, they're still here. Postcode lottery, chief constables have to find what little money they have to try and keep things hard to fill roles. And the plain clothes allowance was an old regulation that went, but these are the sort of the things that we want to fight for if you want us to, and you know, having to provide your own clothes, etc., where your uniform colleagues get a uniform, costs money, you know, and we're not talking vast sums of money, but I think a bit of money to fund your own clothing would potentially help. So you know, these are the sorts of things that we're looking for. Again, after this, if you've got any ideas, contact us. You know, we really want to hear your thoughts. So thank you from me, and I'll pass you over to Mel to close this afternoon.
Thank you. So there's going to be 2 polls in the chat. One around whether you'd like a similar event for detectives again in the future, and there'll also be a rating one, 1 to 5, 5 obviously being high. So you'd obviously like to see those. And if you need any welfare assistance following today's inputs, please reach out to your local forces welfare provisions, or indeed log on to the Police Federation's website, where you heard earlier from Paul Williams around the Ask Twice campaign. There's lots there to assist you if you need some help. And I'd just like to thank the behind the scene teams who've assisted in today's event, and I hope you've all enjoyed it, and hope to see you again, probably on the virtual world, but see you again soon. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone. Good afternoon.